The first sign is not a scream, or a burning city, or an army breaking at the gates. It is quieter than that. A man wakes before dawn with heat behind his eyes and a heaviness in his limbs that feels, at first, like exhaustion. Outside, the city is already stirring. Bakers rake ash from ovens. Mule carts groan through narrow streets. Ships creak against their moorings in the harbour, their holds heavy with grain, oil, cloth, timber, and things no merchant has paid for because no one knows they are there. Fleas, lice, rats, spoiled water, human breath, the invisible luggage of civilization. By midday, the man cannot stand. By evening, someone else in the household is shivering. A neighbour comes to help, then does not return to her own home for 2 days. A priest is called, or a physician, or both, depending on the city and the century. Remedies are prepared with confidence, because confidence is often the last defence people have before understanding fails. Herbs are crushed, amulets are tied, prayers are spoken. The sick are cooled with water, warmed with blankets, bled, fed. Starved, touched, avoided. Some recover, many do not. And then, with a speed that feels almost supernatural, the private disaster of one room becomes the shared terror of a street, then a district, then an empire. Ancient plague is frightening not only because it kills, war kills, famine kills, floods, earthquakes, droughts, and fires all leave their own brutal signatures on the human past. Plague is different because it uses the strength of civilization against itself. The road that carries soldiers also carries infection. The ship that brings grain also brings fever. The market that feeds a city becomes a meeting place for breath, skin, waste, insects, and fear. The crowded house that makes urban life possible becomes a trap. The rituals of care, burial, worship, and mourning, the very actions that make people human, can become pathways for death. No ancient society has the language of microbes. No one sees a bacterium under glass. No one maps a virus. No one speaks of immune systems in the modern sense. Yet people understand patterns. They notice that death follows ships. They notice that certain houses empty faster than others. They notice that corpses multiply after armies arrive, after refugees gather, after rivers flood, after famine weakens bodies, after the weather turns strange. What they cannot see, they try to explain through the tools available to them: polluted air, divine anger, imbalance in the body, corruption of the seasons, foreign contamination, unlucky stars, moral failure, fate. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact identity of several ancient outbreaks. The word plague itself can mislead. In modern use, plague often points to a particular disease caused by Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic plague. In ancient texts, however, plague can mean almost any great epidemic: smallpox, measles, typhus, Ebola-like hemorrhagic fever, influenza, or something that vanished without leaving a clear biological fingerprint. What survives in the record suggests not one single ancient plague, but a series of catastrophes, each arriving in a world that had become large, connected, ambitious, and dangerously exposed. This is where the story begins, not with one doomed city, but with a question that stretches across thousands of years. How close did disease come to breaking the ancient world, not simply killing kings, thinning armies, or terrifying priests, but shaking the foundations of civilization itself? The answer is difficult because civilizations rarely die from one wound. They weaken through combinations: climate stress, war, migration, political failure, economic strain, famine, and disease. No single explanation fully accounts for the great collapses of the past, but plague has a special talent for turning pressure into rupture. It arrives when societies are already stretched, then cuts through labour, trust, authority, trade, food supply, and belief all at once. Imagine a city at its height. Walls rise in stone, temples catch the sun, granaries hold the harvest of distant fields, officials count taxes on tablets, papyrus, parchment, or memory. Soldiers guard gates, merchants haggle over spices, metal, wine, silk, and slaves. Children chase each other through dust. Smoke hangs above workshops. Animals sleep beside people. Waste runs where it can. Water is precious, sometimes clean, often not. Everyone depends on everyone else. And almost no one can afford isolation. Civilization is a miracle of closeness. Plague is the cost of closeness when the wrong organism enters the crowd. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story ahead is not only about death, it is about survival under conditions people did not understand, in worlds that look distant until the pattern begins to feel uncomfortably familiar. Across the ancient Mediterranean, the Near East, North Africa, Europe, and Asia, epidemics appear like dark flashes in the historical record. Sometimes they come with vivid descriptions of symptoms: fever, rash, vomiting, blackened limbs, swollen glands, bleeding, blindness, coughing, thirst, delirium. Sometimes they appear only as numbers that may be exaggerated, but still point toward horror. Thousands dead in a city, corpses unburied, fields abandoned, armies unable to fight, tax systems failing because there are too few living hands to produce what the state demands. Sometimes plague leaves no written testimony at all, only strange burials, hurried pits, broken settlement patterns, genetic traces in old teeth, or a sudden silence where a place had once been active. One lesser-known detail makes the ancient world feel especially vulnerable. Many of its greatest cities depended on imported food. Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Athens, and other urban centres were not self-sufficient islands of stone. They were hungry organisms fed by ships, carts, warehouses, and administrators. Grain moved across seas, oil moved in amphorae, armies moved along roads, animals moved with traders, people moved because of conquest, slavery, pilgrimage, marriage, labour, hunger, exile, and ambition. The larger the system became, the more spectacular its achievements, and the wider its doors stood open. When plague enters such a world, it does not behave like a simple invader marching in a straight line. It blooms unevenly. One port suffers, another waits. One neighbourhood collapses, another survives and wonders why. The wealthy flee to villas and sometimes carry the disease with them. The poor remain in crowded quarters because they have nowhere else to go. Physicians become victims, priests become victims, gravediggers become victims, officials issue orders that may be sensible, cruel, useless, or all three. Rumour moves faster than carts. Suspicion finds targets: foreigners, minorities, travellers, the sick, the dead, and even the healers can become objects of fear. And yet civilization does not simply vanish. That is the haunting part. After the fever passes, someone opens a shop, someone repairs a wall, someone plants barley in a field where the previous household has disappeared, someone inherits property from relatives who no longer exist, someone rewrites a tax register with fewer names. Children grow up surrounded by absences they cannot fully explain. Cities shrink, but do not always die. Empires stagger, but sometimes continue for centuries. Religions absorb the shock and reshape its meaning. Laws adapt. Labour becomes more valuable in some places and more controlled in others. The plague ends, but the world after it is not the world before. This first movement of the story is therefore a descent into uncertainty. The ancient plague that nearly ended civilization is not one neat event locked in a single year. It is a chain of outbreaks that reveals how fragile complex societies can become when biology, environment, and human ambition collide. Athens will show plague striking democracy and war at the same time. Rome will show disease moving with imperial power. The crisis of the 3rd century will show pestilence feeding spiritual and political transformation. Constantinople will show how one spring of death can alter the dream of restoring an empire. Beneath them all runs the same quiet terror the world humans build to protect themselves can become the very network through which catastrophe travels. The sick man at dawn does not know any of this. He does not know that future scholars will argue over the symptoms, or that archaeologists will search graves for clues, or that geneticists will one day drill into ancient teeth looking for fragments of a vanished killer. He knows only heat, thirst, pain, and the changing faces of those who stand near him. Outside, the city continues for a little while as if nothing has changed. The harbour unloads, the market opens, the temple smoke rises. The roads stretch outward into the countryside and beyond, carrying news, goods, people, and something else, something without intention and without mercy, already moving through the arteries of the ancient world. Civilization before the fever is a world of astonishing confidence. It does not see itself as fragile. It sees walls, armies, laws, gods, ships, harvests, money, and memory. It sees stone roads cutting across mountains, harbours crowded with masts, aqueducts carrying water through impossible gradients, temples rising above markets, and scribes reducing the chaos of life into names, quantities, debts, and decrees. The ancient world is not primitive in the way it is sometimes imagined from a distance. It is organized, ambitious, technical, and deeply connected. It has specialists who understand seasons, metals, taxation, architecture, medicine, astronomy, navigation, and war. It has people who can move a grain shipment across the sea, calculate the wages of a labour gang, build a dome, preserve a legal dispute, or coordinate thousands of soldiers over hundreds of miles. But the same world is also intimate with danger. Death is familiar, infant mortality is high, wounds can turn fatal, childbirth is perilous, a bad harvest can become hunger in a single season, a dirty well can kill a household. Most people live close to animals, smoke, insects, damp walls, and human waste. Even the grandest cities smell in ways modern visitors would find hard to endure. The ancient street is alive with donkeys, dogs, pigs, chickens, flies, sewage channels, cooking fires, rotting scraps, tanners' vats, fish stalls, and crowds pressing through lanes too narrow for the population they serve. The beauty of marble does not cancel the reality of filth. Civilization shines, but it sweats. This is the great contradiction that plague exploits. Ancient states learn how to gather people and resources on a scale once unimaginable, but they do not understand the microscopic world gathering with them. A city is a triumph of administration, but it is also an experiment in density. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of people live near one another. sharing water sources, food markets, bathhouses, latrines, workshops, religious spaces, military barracks, and burial grounds. Every human being is a possible host. Every crowd is a possible bridge. Every shipment is a possible container. What survives in the record suggests that the more successful ancient civilization becomes, the more it creates the conditions for epidemic disease to travel farther than any village outbreak could have done alone. The earliest farming communities had already paid a price for settlement. When humans began living permanently with domesticated animals and stored grain, new disease opportunities appeared. Rodents were drawn to food stores. Insects multiplied near waste and water. Animal pathogens found repeated chances to adapt to human bodies. Scholars still debate the precise timing and pathway of many ancient diseases, but the broad pattern is clear. Agriculture brings population growth. Population growth brings density, and density gives infection a future. Nomadic groups suffer disease too, but many epidemics need a steady supply of susceptible hosts. Cities provide that supply. Empires connect those cities. Trade makes them breathe into one another. In the Bronze Age, the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean already form a world of palaces, merchants, treaties, letters, and long-distance exchange. Copper moves from Cyprus. Tin travels across difficult routes. Grain sustains capitals. Luxury goods pass from hand to hand in networks that stretch far beyond what any one ruler controls. Later, the Persian Empire binds enormous territories by road and administration. Greek city-states send settlers, soldiers, traders, and sailors across the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Rome then pushes connectivity to a scale rarely seen before, drawing Britain, Egypt, North Africa, Gaul, Spain, the Balkans, Syria, Anatolia, and Italy into one imperial system of taxation, law, military movement, and trade. That connectivity is our marvel. It also means that a disturbance in one region can become everyone's problem. A poor Nile flood can affect grain supplies elsewhere. A war on a frontier can pull troops across provinces. Refugees can crowd into fortified cities. Merchants can keep moving because stopping trade is rarely simple when cities depend on it. The ancient world is therefore not a collection of isolated dots. It is a web. And plague is a kind of fire that can move along threads invisible to those who maintain them. The military is one of the strongest threads. Soldiers are perfect carriers of ancient catastrophe because they are mobile, crowded, stressed, often poorly nourished, and frequently exposed to unfamiliar environments. Armies sleep in camps where waste management can fail quickly. They besiege cities where hunger and disease often do more work than weapons. They strip countryside, disrupt harvests, and force civilians behind walls. They carry loot, prisoners, animals, and pathogens back from campaigns. Rome's legions, admired for discipline and engineering, are also biological corridors. So are the armies of Persia, Athens, Macedon, Carthage, and later Byzantium. War does not merely kill through blades and arrows. It rearranges human bodies in ways disease can use. Markets form another thread. In a large ancient city, food is not simply food. It is an entire ecology of risk. Grain sits in warehouses where rodents feed and nest. Meat attracts flies. Fish spoils quickly. Water is mixed with human handling at every stage. People gather daily because they must. The poor buy in small amounts, often with little ability to store safely. Sellers come from outside the city, bringing countryside into town. Buyers return into dense neighborhoods. A market is therefore both stomach and lung. It feeds the city and circulates whatever moves among its people. Religion, too, gathers bodies, temples, festivals, sacrifices, pilgrimages, funerals, and public rituals are essential to ancient life. They create meaning, reinforce identity, and ask the gods to keep the world in balance. During fear, they may become even more crowded, because people seek protection when ordinary life begins to break apart. The evidence remains incomplete for many local practices, but across cultures, crisis often intensifies ritual. That human impulse is understandable. It is also dangerous when illness spreads through proximity. The hands that carry offerings may also carry infection. The mourners who honor the dead may become the next dead to be mourned. Medicine exists, and it is not foolish. Ancient physicians observe carefully. Some know that diet, environment, season, water, and lifestyle matter. Greek medical writers describe patterns of disease with impressive attention. Roman public works sometimes improve water supply and drainage. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Indian, and Chinese medical traditions preserve complex bodies of knowledge, remedies, and diagnostic habits. But without germ theory, without antibiotics, without vaccination for most of history, without modern sanitation, and without an understanding of vectors such as fleas or mosquitoes in the modern scientific sense, ancient medicine is fighting in a dark room. It can comfort, sometimes help, sometimes harm, and occasionally observe something deeply true without knowing why. One lesser-known and unsettling detail is that ancient people sometimes understood contagion socially before they understood it biologically. They might avoid certain houses, flee infected districts, refuse contact with the sick, or leave bodies unburied out of terror. Such behavior reveals that they could recognize danger moving between people. Yet fear did not automatically produce effective control. Quarantine as a structured public policy develops more clearly in later periods. Ancient authorities could isolate, expel, pray, clean, burn, or regulate movement in limited ways, but they usually lack the knowledge and administrative tools to interrupt transmission consistently. And when a city needs food every day, sealing itself off can be as deadly as opening its gates. The social structure of ancient civilization also shapes who suffers first and who is remembered afterward. Written records often preserve the perspective of elites, generals, historians, bishops, court officials, philosophers, imperial administrators. They tell us when plague affects armies, kings, councils, tax revenues, or religious interpretation. Far less often do they preserve the names of dock workers, washerwomen, enslaved porters, tenant farmers, wet nurses, street vendors, and children who carried the real weight of epidemic death. Archaeology helps widen the lens, but even graves are uneven witnesses. The poor may be buried simply, hurriedly, or in places that later vanish. The wealthy leave inscriptions. Disease itself is democratic in one sense, but the memory of disease is not. Still, every level of society is tied together in ways plague exposes. An emperor may be far above a baker in status, but the emperor needs bread, soldiers, taxes, and stable cities. The baker needs grain, fuel, customers, and enough living neighbors to keep a market alive. The farmer needs laborers, seed, animals, tools, and protection from raids. A landlord needs tenants. A general needs recruits. A temple needs worshippers. A tax collector needs people who have survived long enough to owe tax. When plague cuts through population, it does not remove isolated individuals from a machine that continues unchanged. It removes connections. It breaks routines. It creates gaps that widen with time. Before the fever, then, civilization is powerful but tense. Its achievements are real, and so are its weaknesses. The ancient city is a monument to cooperation, but also to crowding. The empire is a monument to order, but also to movement. Trade is prosperity, but also exposure. War is conquest, but also circulation. Ritual is comfort, but also gathering. Food supply is organization, but also dependency. No single explanation fully accounts for why some epidemics became turning points, while others faded into local tragedy. But the conditions are already waiting. Civilization has built roads for armies, markets for grain, harbours for ships, and ceremonies for gods. It has not built defences against organisms it cannot imagine. So when the first great outbreaks appear in the historical record, they do not strike an empty landscape. They strike a world that has spent centuries becoming more connected, more urban, more hierarchical, and more dependent on constant motion. They strike palaces where officials count tribute, barracks where soldiers sleep shoulder to shoulder, ports where rats vanish into cargo, and neighbourhoods where families share walls, wells, and air. The plague does not need to invent vulnerability. It only needs to find it. An ancient civilization, for all its brilliance, has already prepared the ground. The invisible traveller does not look like a traveller at all. It has no cloak, no passport, no caravan, no banner snapping above a column of soldiers. It does not know that one kingdom ends and another begins at a river, or that a road belongs to Rome, or that a harbour answers to Athens, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, or Constantinople. It has no loyalty to empire. It follows warmth, blood, breath, waste, skin, grain, insects, animals, and opportunity. It moves because humans move. And ancient humans, despite the illusion of a slower world, are rarely still. A ship leaving an eastern port might carry sacks of grain, jars of oil, woven cloth, pottery, spices, timber, slaves, soldiers, letters, rumours, and prayers for fair weather. It might also carry rats feeding in the dark, fleas clinging to fur, lice in clothing seams, contaminated water in storage jars, or one sailor whose fever has not yet declared itself. For several days, nothing seems wrong. The sea is difficult enough without imagining hidden passengers. Then someone begins to cough, or burn, or swell, or collapse. By the time the ship reaches its next harbour, the disease may already have found new bodies. The cargo is unloaded. Porters carry amphorae through the docks. Merchants argue over payment. Officials inspect goods. Children watch from alleys. The invisible traveller steps ashore inside them all. This is one reason ancient ports are so often haunted by epidemic memory. They are gateways, and gateways are never only entrances for wealth. The same harbours that make cities rich make them porous. Alexandria, with its grain fleets and dense urban life, is not merely a city. It is a hinge between the Nile, the Mediterranean, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Piraeus, the harbour of Athens, connects a proud city to an entire maritime world. Ostia feeds Rome. Constantinople sits like a clasp between seas and continents. Such places are miracles of exchange, but in biological terms they are also meeting chambers where distant ecologies touch. The roads matter just as much. Ancient roads are often celebrated as symbols of order, and rightly so. A paved Roman road crossing hills and valleys is a statement that power can discipline distance. Couriers move faster, armies arrive where they are needed, taxes can be collected, governors can govern, but roads do not choose their cargo. They carry wounded soldiers, merchants, pilgrims, refugees, animals, grain, prisoners, and the sick. They turn local outbreaks into regional threats. A fever that might once have died in a village can now be walked, ridden, carted, or marched into a city that has never seen it before. Disease also travels through empire in less obvious ways. An imperial tax system gathers goods from scattered farms and provinces. Grain is collected, stored, shipped, redistributed, and consumed far from where it grew. Every storage site attracts animals. Every warehouse creates contact between handlers, guards, clerks, labourers, sailors, and buyers. A state that feeds huge cities must keep these channels open even during danger. Hunger is immediate and politically explosive. People may fear disease, but they fear empty granaries too. Ancient authorities can attempt restrictions, but the machinery of survival keeps moving because stopping it may cause a different catastrophe. Armies become another kind of ship on land. They concentrate young men from many regions, place them under stress, and send them into unfamiliar disease environments. A soldier from one province may have no immunity to pathogens common in another. Campaigns disturb landscapes, burn fields, crowd refugees, and create siege conditions where sanitation fails. Camps can become breeding grounds for dysentery, typhus-like illnesses, respiratory infections, and other diseases that thrive where tired bodies sleep close together. Even victorious armies return with more than spoils. They bring memories, scars, captives, and sometimes infection hidden in the blood. One lesser-known detail is that siege warfare may have been among the ancient world's most efficient disease engines. A besieged city crams rural people behind walls, often with livestock and limited clean water. Food spoils, waste accumulates, burial becomes difficult, rats and insects flourish. The besieging army outside suffers its own misery in camps exposed to weather and poor sanitation. Between the two populations lies a zone of violence, hunger, and decay. Ancient writers often describe sieges in terms of courage and betrayal, but disease is frequently the quiet third army, killing without needing ladders or battering rams. Animals form yet another road. Humans do not live apart from them. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, donkeys, dogs, chickens, camels, and rodents are woven into daily life. They provide labour, meat, milk, wool, transport, companionship, sacrifice, and filth. Their bodies host parasites and pathogens. Their movement links stables, markets, farms, military camps, and homes. Not every ancient plague is zoonotic, and scholars still debate which animals mattered most in specific outbreaks. But the larger principle is unavoidable. Ancient civilization is a shared human-animal environment. The boundary between stable and bedroom, granary and nest, street and sewer is often thin. Insects exploit that thinness. Fleas, lice, mosquitoes, and flies do not care about human categories of clean and unclean. They care about bodies and conditions. Fleas can live among rodents and then bite humans. Lice thrive in clothing and hair, especially where people cannot bathe regularly or change garments. Mosquitoes breed in standing water and wetlands. Flies move between waste, food, wounds, and faces. Ancient cities may have fountains, baths, drains, and aqueducts. But these improvements are uneven, and they do not create a modern sanitary world. Many people still live beside stagnant water, refuse heaps, animal dung, and crowded sleeping spaces. For a pathogen that needs a vector, the ancient city is full of small wings and jumping legs. Water can be a blessing and a betrayal. Rivers sustain cities, irrigate fields, turn mills, float cargo, and define sacred landscapes. Wells and cisterns make settlement possible. Aqueducts are among the great achievements of ancient engineering. Yet water also carries contamination when waste enters supply systems, when floods disturb burial grounds, when armies camp upstream, or when drought concentrates impurities. Many epidemic diseases are not waterborne, but enough are that bad water becomes one of the most persistent dangers of pre-modern life. People may recognize foul water as dangerous, but recognizing danger is not the same as being able to eliminate it, especially in a crowded city under stress. The invisible traveller also moves through care. This is one of the cruelest facts of epidemic history. People nurse the sick because they love them, because duty requires it, because religion demands compassion, because households cannot function otherwise, or because there is no one else. They wash bodies, change bedding, carry water, touch skin, wipe mouths, hold children, bury parents. These acts are the opposite of savagery. They are civilization at its most tender, and yet, depending on the disease, they may also become routes of transmission. Plague does not only punish greed, conquest, or filth, it can punish kindness. Fear changes movement too. When disease becomes visible, those with means often flee. Ancient writers sometimes condemn this as cowardice or moral failure, but flight is also instinct. The rich go to country estates, officials leave cities, traders divert routes, families abandon houses, the sick are sometimes left behind. But flight can scatter infection outward. A city that empties may seed its countryside. A fleeing household may bring disease to a village that had been safe. The very attempt to escape the web can extend it. Rumour travels alongside disease, and sometimes faster. In a world without laboratory tests, people search for causes in whatever pattern they can see. The outbreak follows foreigners, so foreigners are blamed. It appears after a comet, an eclipse, an earthquake, a famine, or an enemy army. So the sign becomes the explanation. It strikes after a religious offence, so divine anger is invoked. It arrives from a rival region, so moral suspicion attaches to geography. The evidence remains incomplete for many local reactions, but the human tendency is clear across time. Invisible threats demand visible culprits. When knowledge fails, accusation becomes a dark form of order. Yet the invisible traveller is not unstoppable in every setting. Some outbreaks burn out. Some fail to cross environmental barriers. Some pathogens require conditions that are not always present. Some communities are spared by chance, distance, prior exposure, season, or social structure. Ancient observers sometimes notice this unevenness and find it baffling. Why does one house die and another survive? Why does a crowded quarter suffer while a nearby district remains strangely intact? Why does disease fade in summer or winter, then return without microbes, immunity, vectors, and incubation periods? These patterns seem almost moral or cosmic. In reality, they're biological, ecological, and often brutally random. This randomness gives ancient plague much of its mystery. It is not a simple wave washing evenly over a map. It is a chain of encounters. A flea bites, a sailor coughs, a soldier shares a blanket, a corpse is washed, a grain sack is opened, a festival gathers bodies, a refugee convoy reaches a gate, a rat dies beneath a warehouse floor, a child drinks from a foul jar. Most such moments leave no trace. History records the emperor who falls ill, the general who loses an army, the historian who survives to describe terror. It rarely records the exact touch, bite, breath, or cup that carried catastrophe into a new life. By the time an outbreak is visible to authority, it is often already ahead of authority. The city reacts to what the pathogen did days or weeks earlier. Orders follow symptoms, but transmission may precede symptoms. Burials follow deaths, but infection may already be moving among mourners. Ships are noticed after arrival, not during the hidden days at sea. Armies are inspected after the march, not at the first invisible exchange in camp. This delay is one of the oldest advantages disease has over human organization. Civilization can count the dead. It struggles to count what has not yet appeared. And so the ancient world, with all its roads and harbours and rituals, becomes a landscape of unseen motion. The plague does not need intelligence, only access. It crosses thresholds in clothing seams, fur, breath, blood, water, and grain dust. It rides inside the ordinary systems people depend on: food, trade, war, worship, care, escape. This is why the story cannot remain in palaces or chronicles alone. To understand how disease nearly broke civilization, the eye must follow the smallest routes through the larger structures. The empire is visible in stone. The plague is visible only after it's passed through flesh. Somewhere a ship docks, somewhere a cart reaches a market, somewhere a soldier returns home with a fever he thinks will pass, somewhere a family opens its door to help a neighbour. None of these moments looks historic while it is happening. They look like daily life. That is the unsettling truth. Ancient plague does not enter civilization from outside like a monster at the wall. It enters through civilization's own habits, through the very movement that keeps the world alive. The bodies in the record do not speak easily. They lie under city streets, beneath church floors, outside old walls, in hurried pits, in formal cemeteries, in family tombs reused too many times, and in places where no marker survives at all. Some are found carefully arranged, with offerings placed by hands that still had time for ritual. Others are discovered in dense layers, limbs crossing limbs, skulls turned at impossible angles. The dead packed together with the speed and blunt practicality that only crisis produces. A mass grave is never just a collection of bones. It is a moment when ordinary customs failed. For a long time, the history of ancient plague depended mainly on texts. Historians, physicians, bishops, officials, poets, and chroniclers described outbreaks in the language available to them. They wrote of fever, sores, vomiting, diarrhea, coughing, blackened skin, delirium, unbearable thirst, swollen parts of the body, sudden collapse, and cities filled with funerals. Some descriptions are vivid enough to feel almost clinical. Others are shaped by theology, politics, grief, or literary tradition. Ancient writers often borrow from earlier writers, and this complicates the evidence. A later author describing a plague may echo an older famous account, because that is how educated people were trained to write catastrophe. The result is a record that can be powerful and slippery at the same time. This is why scholars still debate the identity of many ancient epidemics. A list of symptoms in a text is not the same thing as a diagnosis. Words shift meaning. Observers focus on dramatic signs and may ignore common ones. Translation adds another layer of uncertainty. A term that sounds like a modern medical symptom may have carried a broader meaning in the original language, even when a writer is careful. He may describe what he sees among the sick without knowing which symptoms are essential and which are secondary. Fever appears in countless diseases. Rash can mean many things. Bleeding can occur in different infections. Swellings may point toward bubonic plague, but not every swelling is a bubo. The evidence remains incomplete, and the dead do not come labelled. Archaeology changes the conversation because it does not rely only on what people said happened. It asks what the ground remembers. A sudden increase in burials can reveal demographic shock. Graves dug quickly can suggest emergency conditions. Bodies placed without normal rites may indicate fear, haste, or social breakdown. Cemeteries expanding beyond expected limits can hint at mortality beyond ordinary patterns. In some places, settlement contraction, abandoned houses, reduced craft production, or changes in diet may speak indirectly of epidemic loss. None of these signs proves plague by itself. War, famine, massacre, migration, or natural disaster can produce similar traces. But when archaeological patterns align with written testimony and environmental evidence, the shadow sharpens. One lesser-known detail is that teeth have become among the most important witnesses in the study of ancient disease. The hard enamel protects inner material, and dental pulp can preserve traces of blood-borne pathogens long after soft tissue has vanished. In recent decades, ancient DNA research has transformed what can be asked of old skeletons. Scientists can sample teeth from burial sites, search for fragments of pathogen DNA, and sometimes identify the organism that infected a person near death. This does not work everywhere. DNA preservation depends on temperature, soil chemistry, time, contamination, and luck. Many graves yield nothing. Yet when it works, it can turn a historical suspicion into biological evidence. This has been especially important for plague caused by Yersinia pestis. For centuries, scholars argued over whether the great early medieval pandemic associated with Justinian was truly bubonic plague in the same biological family as the later Black Death. Written sources described swellings and mass death, but texts alone could not settle the matter. Ancient DNA changed that. In some early medieval graves, researchers have found genetic evidence of Yersinia pestis, showing that the bacterium was indeed present in at least parts of that pandemic. That does not solve every question. It does not tell us the exact mortality everywhere, the precise route of spread in every region, or why some places suffered more than others. But it gives the invisible traveller a name in certain graves. For earlier outbreaks, the picture is often murkier. The plague that struck Athens in the 5th century BCE has been linked by different scholars to typhus, typhoid fever, smallpox, measles, viral hemorrhagic fever, and other possibilities. The Antonine Plague in the Roman Empire is often suspected to have been smallpox, or a smallpox-like disease, but certainty remains out of reach. The plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century has drawn suggestions ranging from viral hemorrhagic fever to measles or another severe epidemic disease. In each case, the temptation is to solve the mystery with a modern label. But responsible history moves carefully. What survives in the record suggests catastrophic epidemics, yet no single diagnosis fully accounts for every description. The challenge is not simply scientific, it is also human. Ancient people did not always count deaths in ways modern demographers would trust. Numbers in chronicles can be symbolic, exaggerated, rounded, or based on rumour. A writer may say thousands died each day in a city, and the claim may express real horror, even if the exact figure is impossible to verify. Some accounts are written close to the event, others are written decades later. Some authors have political motives, using plague to criticize rulers, explain military defeat, or frame moral decline. Religious writers may present disease as judgment, purification, trial, or a sign of the end times. None of this makes them useless. It makes them human sources, not machines. Even mass graves require caution. A pit filled with bodies can suggest epidemic, but it can also suggest massacre. Osteological evidence may show trauma in some cases, but many diseases kill without leaving marks on bone. Most acute infections do not carve obvious signatures into the skeleton. A person can die of fever, organ failure, dehydration, or respiratory distress, and leave bones that look ordinary centuries later. The absence of visible disease on bone is not evidence that disease was absent. This silence is one of archaeology's frustrations. The greatest killers often pass through soft tissue and vanish. Sometimes burial practice offers clues. In normal times, communities tend to follow recognizable traditions. Bodies may be oriented in certain directions, accompanied by objects, placed individually, cremated, wrapped, or arranged according to status, religion, and local custom. During epidemic crisis, those patterns may shift. Graves become shallower. Multiple bodies share the same pit. Ritual goods disappear. The young and old appear together in unusual proportions. Burials move to the edge of settlements or outside walls, yet even here, interpretation is delicate. Poverty can simplify burial. Changing religion can alter rites. Urban space can force reuse. The evidence must be read as a pattern, not a single dramatic image. Texts and bones also disagree in interesting ways. A chronicle may describe near-total devastation, while archaeology suggests continuity. A cemetery may reveal sudden mortality where no written source mentions disaster. This imbalance is partly because literacy is uneven. Many communities leave no local account. Rural suffering may be invisible to elite writers focused on capitals and courts. Conversely, writers in major cities may experience a plague as world-ending because their world is the city. A village 50 miles away might suffer less, later, or differently. Disease history is therefore not one map but many overlapping maps of exposure, memory, class, and survival. Environmental evidence adds another layer. Tree rings can reveal years of poor growth linked to cooling or drought. Ice cores can preserve traces of volcanic eruptions that dimmed sunlight and disrupted climate. Pollen records can suggest changes in land use, agriculture, and woodland recovery when human pressure declines. Sediments can preserve flood histories. These records do not show plague directly, but they show the conditions in which plague may become more deadly. Famine weakens bodies. Climate stress drives migration. Crop failure crowds people into relief centres or cities. Cold and wet conditions can alter rodent populations, insect behaviour, and food supply. No single explanation fully accounts for epidemic collapse. But environmental stress can turn disease from tragedy into transformation. The most haunting evidence may be the absence left behind. A workshop that stops producing, a villa abandoned, a tax register with fewer names, a field returning to scrub, a cemetery with a sudden crowd of children, a layer of urban neglect, a road still present but less travelled. These are not as dramatic as a historian's description of corpses piled in streets, but they may be closer to how plague reshaped ordinary life. Civilization rarely collapses in a single theatrical moment. It thins. It falters. It loses specialists, parents, labourers, priests, soldiers, scribes, and memory keepers. It forgets how to maintain things that once seemed permanent. Modern science can recover some of this, but not all. Ancient DNA may identify a pathogen in one burial site, but that does not prove the same pathogen killed everyone in a wider pandemic. A written account may describe symptoms accurately for one region, while another suffers a different disease at the same time. Several infections may move together through weakened populations. famine and plague may blur, because starvation changes the way bodies respond to illness. War may hide epidemic mortality beneath the language of military crisis. The ancient world does not preserve catastrophe in neat categories. Still, the pieces are enough to reveal a terrifying pattern. Great epidemics do not appear as isolated medical events. They leave marks in texts, graves, economies, settlement patterns, religious thought, and political decisions. They bend the behavior of states. They alter the confidence of cities. They force people to improvise rituals around death when death comes too quickly for tradition. They create stories that later generations repeat, reshape, doubt, and fear. The bodies in the record remind us that ancient plague is not an abstraction. It is not only a line in a chronicle or a debate about pathogens. It is a mother and child placed together because no one has time to separate grief into proper forms. It is a soldier buried far from home with no inscription. It is an old cemetery suddenly overwhelmed. It is a tooth holding a microscopic trace of the thing that ended a life. It is the strange intimacy of science reaching across centuries to identify an enemy the dead themselves never saw. And as the evidence gathers, imperfect but persistent, the story begins to narrow. From the broad vulnerability of ancient civilization, from roads and ships and markets and armies, the eye turns toward one city where plague enters at the worst possible moment, a city at war, a city crowded behind walls, a city certain of its brilliance. Athens will become one of the first great case studies in how epidemic disease can strike not only bodies, but politics, morality, memory, and the idea of civilization itself. Athens is already under pressure when the sickness comes. The city is not standing peacefully in its golden age, untouched and serene, waiting for disaster as if history has arranged a lesson. It is crowded, tense, proud, and afraid. War has changed the rhythm of daily life. The countryside of Attica, normally a living landscape of farms, shrines, olive groves, vines, stone walls, wells, and family graves, has emptied inward. People who once measured time by pruning, harvest. And the needs of animals now live inside the defensive reach of the city and its long walls. Those astonishing corridors of stone that connect Athens to the sea. The walls are meant to make Athens unbreakable. They also make it dangerously full. The Peloponnesian War has begun, and Athens faces Sparta, a rival whose strength lies not in ships and silver and restless public debate, but in land power, discipline, and fearsome reputation. The Athenian strategy is brutally logical. Do not meet Sparta's army in open battle. Let the countryside be ravaged if necessary. Keep the city supplied by sea. Trust the navy. Trust the walls. Trust the empire and the tribute that flow into Athens from across the Aegean. It is a plan built on maritime power and imperial confidence, and in purely military terms it has a kind of cold brilliance. But it depends on one assumption no one can test: that the city can survive being packed with people, animals, goods, fear, and heat for as long as the war requires. Then, in the second year of the war, disease enters. Ancient testimony places the outbreak first in the port of Piraeus, which is exactly where one might expect an invisible traveller to arrive. Piraeus is Athens' lung and stomach, the place where the city breathes in the wider world and feeds itself from it. Ships come from across the eastern Mediterranean, sailors, merchants, rowers, dock workers, officials, enslaved labourers, and travellers pass through in constant motion. The disease then moves upward toward the city itself. For Athenians already strained by war, the timing feels almost designed by hostile fate. The Spartans are outside. The plague is inside. The walls that protect the population from spears cannot protect lungs, blood, skin, or bowels. The symptoms described by the historian Thucydides are among the most famous and disturbing in ancient literature. He writes as a survivor, and that matters. He is not passing along distant rumour. He lives through the plague and later gives an account shaped by observation, memory, and the intellectual discipline of a man determined to separate human events from myth. The illness he describes begins suddenly, with heat in the head, inflamed eyes, throat and tongue affected, foul breath, sneezing, hoarseness, coughing, chest pain, stomach distress, vomiting, spasms, intense fever, restlessness, ulcers, diarrhea, thirst so severe that some sufferers throw themselves into water, and in many cases death within days. Those who survive may lose fingers, toes, eyesight, or memory. It is an awful description, and modern readers naturally want to diagnose it. But scholars still debate what the Athenian plague actually was. That uncertainty is important. The plague of Athens has been proposed as typhus, typhoid fever, smallpox, measles, influenza, ergot poisoning, viral hemorrhagic fever, or another disease that does not fit neatly into modern categories. Some studies have suggested possible evidence for typhoid fever from ancient remains, but the interpretation has been contested, and no single explanation fully accounts for every reported symptom. The phrase Plague of Athens therefore names an event more securely than it names a pathogen. We know a devastating epidemic struck the city during the war. We know it killed many people and traumatized Athenian society. The exact biological identity of the killer remains unresolved. What makes the Athenian plague so powerful as a historical episode is not only the suffering, but the collision between disease and civic order. Athens is not merely a place. It is an experiment in political identity, imperial ambition, public speech, religious practice, and collective self-confidence. Its citizens debate policy, serve on juries, vote in assemblies, honour gods, attend festivals, watch tragedies, and imagine themselves as participants in a civilization unlike any other. The plague does not politely remain a medical crisis. It enters every part of this world. It changes how people bury the dead, how they regard the gods, how they obey laws, how they judge pleasure, risk, and responsibility. Thucydides describes a breakdown in burial customs. There are too many dead, too quickly, and too many households already weakened. Families cannot always perform proper rites. Some place bodies on funeral pyres prepared for others. Some abandon tradition under the pressure of necessity. In a society where burial is not a minor detail, but a sacred obligation, this is more than logistical failure. It is a sign that the boundary between civilization and chaos has become thin. The dead are not merely bodies to be removed. They are members of households, ancestors, citizens, and participants in the religious order. When they cannot be honoured properly, the living feel the world losing shape. Fear also damages morality. According to Thucydides, people become less restrained because life feels suddenly temporary. Wealth changes hands rapidly. Those who expect to die choose immediate pleasure over long discipline. Laws lose force when no one believes the future will arrive to judge them. Religious appeals weaken because the pious and impious die alike. This may be partly moral analysis, partly elite anxiety, partly the historian's attempt to capture the psychological shock of epidemic life. But what survives in the record suggests a genuine crisis of meaning. Plague makes ordinary consequences uncertain. It punishes virtue and vice without distinction. That randomness is spiritually corrosive, One lesser-known detail is that Athens' own imperial structure may have deepened the disaster. The city's wealth and survival depended on tribute, shipping, naval manpower, and constant contact with allied and subject communities. Its strength lay in connection, and connection is exactly what epidemic disease uses. The same maritime system that allowed Athens to resist Sparta also helped expose it to whatever entered through Piraeus. This does not mean empire caused the plague in any simple sense, but it does show the ancient pattern again. The machinery of power doubles as the machinery of vulnerability. The death of Pericles gives the plague its most symbolic victim. Pericles is the dominant statesman of Athens, associated with its imperial policy, building programs, funeral oratory, and wartime strategy. He has already lost close family members to the disease before he himself dies. His death does not instantly doom Athens, but it removes a figure whose authority had helped hold the city's strategy together. Later Athenian politics become more volatile, more aggressive, and at times more reckless. It would be too simple to say the plague caused Athens to lose the Peloponnesian War. The war lasts for many years after the epidemic, and many decisions, battles, alliances, and accidents shape the outcome. But the plague wounds Athens early, draining manpower, confidence, leadership, and moral cohesion at a critical moment. The numbers are uncertain. Ancient figures suggest enormous losses, including a significant portion of the population and military manpower, but exact mortality remains debated. Still, even cautious estimates point to catastrophe in a city dependent on rowers, soldiers, craftsmen, farmers, officials, enslaved workers, and citizens capable of participating in public life. The death of thousands is not just demographic, it is structural. Every dead person leaves behind unfinished labour, contested inheritance, orphaned children, weakened households, and gaps in networks of trust. Plague turns population into absence. The overcrowding behind the walls must have made suffering worse. Refugees from the countryside lived in makeshift conditions, perhaps in sanctuaries, open spaces, sheds, or cramped quarters not designed for long-term habitation. Animals may have been brought in. Water and waste systems faced pressure, heat, stress, grief, and poor nutrition would have weakened bodies. The evidence remains incomplete, but the logic is grim. Athens had deliberately concentrated its people for strategic survival, and in doing so, it likely created ideal conditions for disease transmission. The city became both fortress and trap. Yet Athens does not vanish. This is one of the strange lessons of ancient plague. Even after mass death, social breakdown, and political trauma, the city continues. Assemblies meet, fleets sail, plays are performed, arguments continue. Athenians still imagine victory. Human communities can absorb astonishing punishment, especially when institutions, memory, and necessity force life forward. The plague nearly breaks Athens, but it does not erase it. Instead, it changes the texture of its history. It leaves behind a darker awareness of chance, bodily vulnerability, and the limits of reason. There is something deeply unsettling in the Athenian case because it strikes a society that believed strongly in human intelligence. Athens is remembered for philosophy, drama, architecture, history, rhetoric, and political experiment. Yet when the plague arrives, brilliance does not save it. Physicians die like everyone else. Prayers do not halt the fever. Strategy cannot control what moves invisibly through households. The city that debates justice and empire with extraordinary sophistication finds itself reduced to thirst, heat, fear, and hurried burial. Civilization is still present, but it is no longer in command. The plague of Athens becomes, in this sense, one of the earliest great warnings in the record of the ancient Mediterranean. It shows that epidemic disease can intervene in history not as background misery, but as a force capable of altering war, leadership, law, ritual, and belief. It does not need to destroy every wall to change the fate of a city. It only has to enter the crowded spaces behind them, and once it does, the proud distinction between battlefield and home, foreign enemy and domestic safety, public policy and private grief begins to collapse. When the fever finally loosens its grip, Athens is still standing, but not untouched. The fields beyond the walls have been ravaged. The dead have thinned families and ranks. Pericles is gone. The war continues. The sea still carries grain and danger. The assemblies still argue beneath a sky that has not changed. But something in the city's confidence has been altered. Athens has learned that an empire may command ships, tribute, walls, and words, yet still be helpless before a force too small to see. Rome under a darkening sky is not yet the ruined empire of later imagination. It is still vast, disciplined, wealthy, and frighteningly capable. Its roads run through provinces that earlier kings could only have dreamed of holding. Its legions stand along frontiers from the deserts of the east to the forests and rivers of the north. Its coins carry imperial faces across markets where people may never see the emperor but still feel his demands. Its cities are crowded with baths, theatres, temples, workshops, shrines, apartment blocks, taverns, warehouses, and courts. Rome has problems, as every empire does, but in the middle of the 2nd century it can still look almost permanent. Then the soldiers come home sick. The outbreak remembered as the Antonine Plague appears during the reigns of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. After Roman forces campaign in the east, ancient sources connect its spread with troops returning from war against Parthia, though the exact pathway remains debated. The empire's military success becomes entangled with biological disaster. Legions move, supply lines stretch, prisoners are taken, cities are entered, camps fill and empty, and the disease travels along the same imperial arteries that make Roman power possible. Once again, conquest opens doors that no general intended to open. The disease is often suspected to have been smallpox, or a closely related infection, because some ancient descriptions mention fever, pustular eruptions, scabbing, and severe mortality, but certainty remains beyond reach. Scholars still debate the diagnosis, and the surviving descriptions are too limited to settle the matter completely. What is less doubtful is the scale of disruption. The Antonine Plague struck repeatedly for years, affecting armies, cities, and rural populations. It did not end Rome, but it made the empire feel mortal. The army mattered most immediately. Rome's frontiers depended on trained manpower, logistics, and the confidence that legions could be shifted where needed. An epidemic among soldiers does more than reduce headcounts. It weakens units, slows campaigns, interrupts recruitment, and erodes morale. A legion is not simply a crowd of men with weapons. It is a living machine of discipline, hierarchy, engineering skill, shared habits, and accumulated experience. When disease kills veterans, officers, mule handlers, craftsmen, medics, clerks, and recruits, it damages the machine in ways that cannot be repaired overnight. A dead soldier can be replaced in theory. A dead system of skill is harder. The civilian world also suffers. Fields need workers, estates need tenants and enslaved labourers, mines need bodies. Tax collection depends on production. Cities depend on food arriving from elsewhere. If plague thins labour, harvests can shrink, prices can rise, and local economies can wobble. The evidence remains incomplete, and historians disagree about how severe the long-term economic effects were. Some older interpretations made the Antonine Plague a decisive turning point from Roman strength to decline. Many modern scholars are more cautious. Rome had immense reserves. It adapted. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the strains that followed. An epidemic mortality clearly added weight to an empire already managing war, succession, frontier pressure, and administrative complexity. One lesser-known effect may be visible in the imperial state's growing need to improvise. Marcus Aurelius faces military emergencies on the Danube while disease drains manpower. Recruiting becomes more urgent. Some sources suggest unusual enlistments and social measures, though the details are difficult to pin down. The empire must keep its frontiers defended even as the population base suffers. This is one of the quiet terrors of ancient plague. The state's obligations do not shrink just because its people do. Taxes are still needed, soldiers are still needed, grain is still needed, roads, walls, and fleets still require maintenance. The living inherit the workload of the dead. Marcus Aurelius himself becomes a haunting figure in this landscape. Later generations remember him as the philosopher-emperor, writing private reflections on discipline, mortality, duty, and the instability of life. It would be too neat to reduce his thought to the plague, but he rules in a world where death is not abstract. War and disease press against the reign. The imperial image remains controlled. But beneath it lies a human being watching the empire bleed from causes no policy can fully command. Rome's official monuments speak in the language of victory. The epidemic speaks in silence, in missing labourers, interrupted households, and military rosters that no longer match reality. The Antonine Plague also reveals something about imperial scale. In a small kingdom, an epidemic can devastate the centre but remain geographically limited. In Rome, the centre and edges are tied by constant movement. Soldiers from one province serve in another. Merchants follow armies. Officials travel. Grain moves. Slaves are transported. Letters and orders circulate. Roads and sea lanes compress distance. The empire is not a modern nation-state, but it is highly connected by ancient standards, and that connection gives disease endurance. An outbreak can flare in one region, fade, then reappear elsewhere as susceptible populations encounter it anew. Cities like Rome are especially exposed. The capital is enormous by ancient standards, dependent on imported grain, dense housing, and vast flows of people and goods. Insulae, the apartment blocks of the urban poor, can be crowded and poorly ventilated. Public baths gather bodies. Public entertainments gather crowds. Temples and shrines offer ritual comfort. Markets feed everyone and expose everyone. Wealth creates private space for some, but even elites depend on servants, clients, suppliers, and public life. No wall inside society fully separates one class from another when disease has enough pathways. Yet Rome's reaction is not preserved for us in the intimate detail that Athens receives from Thucydides. The record is scattered, uneven, and often filtered through later writers. We hear of mortality, of imperial measures, of the disease's recurrence, of its association with a war. We do not hear the voices of most families who endured it. That absence matters. The Antonine Plague may have been one of the most consequential epidemics of antiquity, yet its human texture is partly lost. What survives in the record suggests disaster, but the silence around ordinary grief is immense. Religious life likely absorbed the shock. In the Roman world, epidemic could be interpreted through divine displeasure, ritual impurity, fate, or the anger of neglected gods. Sacrifices, vows, processions, and appeals to healing deities may have intensified. At the same time, different religious communities would have responded through their own frameworks. The empire was spiritually crowded traditional Roman cults, local gods, mystery religions, philosophical schools, Jewish communities, emerging Christian groups, and countless household practices coexisted and competed. Plague did not create this diversity, but it gave every tradition a terrible question to answer. Why do people die in masses, and what obligations do the living have? The disease also enters the imagination of decline, though with caution. It is tempting to draw a straight line from the Antonine Plague to Rome's later crises, to say that the empire begins dying when the fever arrives. History is rarely so obedient. Rome remains powerful after the plague. It fights, builds, taxes, legislates, and survives. But the outbreak belongs to a sequence of pressures that make the 2nd and 3rd centuries less stable than the age that came before. Frontier wars grow more demanding, political succession becomes more dangerous, the army's role in imperial power expands, economic strains deepen in places, population loss may have reduced resilience. The plague is not the whole story, but it darkens the background against which later crises unfold. In this way, the Antonine Plague differs from the Plague of Athens. Athens is a city-state at war, its disaster concentrated and dramatically narrated. Rome is an empire, and its epidemic is broader, more diffuse, harder to see all at once. It moves through an enormous organism. Its consequences are not contained in one assembly or one leader's death. Though emperors and armies are affected, it is felt through systems recruitment, taxation, trade, settlement, production, confidence. The Roman world does not collapse in spectacle. It absorbs the blow, then carries the bruise forward. There is a strange irony in Rome's resilience. Because the empire survives, the plague can seem less catastrophic than it was. A society that endures leaves evidence of continuity, and continuity can disguise trauma. The baths still operate in some places. Coins are still minted, laws are still issued, armies still march. But survival is not the same as health. A body can keep walking after a wound. An empire can keep governing after losing people it cannot truly replace. The question is not whether Rome falls immediately. It does not. The question is how much strength the plague removes from a structure that will soon need every reserve it has. The darkening sky over Rome is therefore not a single eclipse. It is a dimming of certainty. The empire that once seemed to expand naturally now confronts limits. Its enemies are not only beyond the frontier, some are inside breath, skin, and blood. Victory in the east can return as fever in the west. A road built for command can carry weakness. A soldier who survives battle can die in bed. The imperial system still appears magnificent, but the Antonine Plague reveals the cost of magnitude. Rome is powerful because it connects so much of the world. Rome is vulnerable for the same reason. And beyond this plague, another crisis waits. The empire will face more disease, more war, more political fracture, and a 3rd century storm in which plague becomes not merely a disaster, but part of a broader transformation of power and belief. The Antonine outbreak teaches Rome that epidemic can wound an empire. The next great wave will arrive in a world even more strained, where the question is no longer whether Rome can feel pain, but how many shocks it can endure before it begins to change into something else. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman world no longer feels like a machine running with grim confidence. It feels like a machine being struck from every side, while its operators argue over who is allowed to hold the levers. Emperors rise and fall with alarming speed. Armies make and unmake rulers. Frontiers buckle under pressure. Provinces fracture into breakaway powers. Coins lose trust as their silver content declines. Trade suffers. Cities worry. Farmers endure taxation, raids, requisitions, and uncertainty. The empire still exists, but it no longer gives the same impression of inevitability. Then disease returns, and this time it enters a world already burning. The epidemic remembered as the plague of Cyprian begins around the middle of the 3rd century and lasts in waves for years. Its name comes from Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, whose writings preserve one of the most vivid Christian responses to the disaster. The exact disease remains uncertain. Scholars still debate whether it may have been a viral hemorrhagic fever, smallpox, measles, influenza, or another epidemic infection. Ancient descriptions mention fever, weakness, vomiting, diarrhea, throat wounds, eye problems, bodily decay, and in some accounts bleeding or gangrenous damage, but the evidence remains incomplete. The name gives us a historical frame, not a secure diagnosis. What matters most is the timing. A plague in a stable society is terrible. A plague in a society already facing political, military, economic, and spiritual crisis becomes something more dangerous. It confirms dread. It makes every weakness visible. It turns administrative strain into human absence. Soldiers die when the frontiers need defense. Farmers die when food supply is already uncertain. Officials die when the state needs control. Priests, bishops, healers, servants, merchants, children, and enslaved workers vanish into the same emergency. The disease becomes one more fire in an empire that has too many fires to extinguish. The 3rd century crisis is often described through emperors and invasions. But plague changes the scale of the story. It brings imperial instability into houses and streets. A distant usurper may be frightening in political terms, but a fever in the household is immediate. The state can feel abstract until bodies begin failing around the cooking fire, the courtyard, the barracks, the workshop, the bath, the church, the shrine, the market stall. Epidemic turns history into touch. It reduces grand strategy to the question of who can fetch water, who can bury the dead, who can stand, who can breathe until morning. In Carthage, Cyprian interprets the plague through Christian belief. For him, the catastrophe is not proof that the world is meaningless. It is a test, a trial, and a reminder that earthly life is fragile. His response is striking because it frames care for the sick as a religious duty, not only toward fellow Christians, but, at least in ideal terms, toward enemies as well. This does not mean every Christian community behaved heroically, or that non-Christians lacked compassion. Ancient people of many traditions cared for the ill, but Christian writings from this period present epidemic charity as a powerful moral identity. In a world where fear encourages abandonment, organized care becomes a form of witness. This is one of the surprising details of plague history. Disease can strengthen a religious movement not because it proves the movement true in any laboratory sense, but because it gives that movement a public stage for discipline, courage, and explanation. Christianity in the 3rd century is still a minority religion, sometimes persecuted, sometimes tolerated, growing unevenly across cities and regions. The plague does not single-handedly convert the empire. That would be far too simple. But what survives in the record suggests that epidemics created moments in which Christian communities could demonstrate solidarity, care, and a theology capable of making suffering meaningful. In a frightened city, that mattered. At the same time, plague could intensify suspicion. If traditional gods seemed angry, someone must have offended them. Christians, who refused sacrifice to the old gods, were easy targets for blame in some contexts. To many Roman observers, religious refusal was not a private preference. It was a threat to the sacred order that protected the community. If disease ravaged the city, the anger of neglected gods seemed plausible. Thus, the same epidemic that allowed Christians to organize compassion could also expose them to accusation. Plague does not produce one reaction. It produces competing explanations, each fighting to control fear. The Roman state itself struggles to maintain coherence. During the 3rd century, emperors often rule briefly, sometimes violently removed by troops or rivals. The empire's edges are under pressure from Persians in the east and various groups across the northern frontiers. The so-called Gallic Empire breaks way in the west for a time, while Palmyra rises in the east. These political fractures have many causes, but epidemic mortality likely worsens the difficulty of restoring order. No single explanation fully accounts for the crisis, yet disease reduces the pool of manpower and trust at precisely the moment when both are needed most. Cities feel the strain in ways that are hard to measure but easy to imagine. A city depends on rhythm deliveries, markets, courts, festivals, maintenance, tax payments, household labour, and burial routines. Plague breaks rhythm. Shops close because owners die or customers disappear. Streets empty, then crowd around funerals. Public spaces become places of avoidance. Wealthy households may withdraw. Poorer households may have no such option. Enslaved workers may be forced into the most dangerous forms of care and corpse handling. The formal record rarely centres them, but the burden of epidemic labour often falls on those with the least power to refuse it. There is also the problem of bodies. Every society has rules for the dead, because the dead are not simply biological remains. They are social beings whose departure must be managed through ritual, memory, and place. In epidemic conditions, death can outrun ceremony. Graves may be hurried, priests may be overwhelmed, families may be too sick to mourn properly. Corpses may become frightening not only because they represent loss, but because they seem to carry danger. When burial customs fail, people feel that the world is failing at a deeper level. The plague of Cyprian, like the plague of Athens before it, shows how disease attacks the moral architecture of a society. The medical response remains limited. Physicians can observe symptoms, offer treatments, and provide comfort. But the biological causes are beyond ancient understanding. Remedies may include diet, purging, bleeding, herbs, prayers, amulets, or adjustments of air and environment. Some interventions might soothe, others might harm. Most cannot stop a major epidemic. This helplessness is psychologically important. When a state cannot protect, when doctors cannot cure. When gods do not visibly intervene, people search for other forms of certainty. They may turn inward, toward asceticism or prayer. They may turn outward, toward blame. They may cling to pleasure, as in Athens, or to discipline, as Cyprian urges. Plague makes philosophy practical. Meanwhile, the empire's economy continues under pressure. Labour loss can make agricultural production more difficult. Tax obligations may remain even when households shrink. Inflation and coinage problems undermine confidence. Local elites, who traditionally support civic life through gifts, buildings, games, and administration, may become less willing or less able to bear public burdens. Again, historians debate how far plague directly drives these changes. The evidence remains incomplete, but epidemic mortality does not need to be the sole cause of transformation to matter. It only needs to weaken resilience. A society can survive war, inflation, and political instability separately. When they converge with disease, survival becomes harsher and more uneven. There is a grim pattern here that returns across history. Plague rarely acts alone. It joins a crowd. It appears beside war, hunger, displacement, religious anxiety, and political failure. Then later generations argue over which force mattered most, as if catastrophe must have a single author. The 3rd century resists that simplicity. Rome's crisis is not caused by one plague, one emperor, one invasion, one tax policy, or one religious change. It is a convergence. Disease is one of the forces that makes the convergence feel apocalyptic to those living through it. And yet, out of this fire, the empire changes rather than simply ending. Later emperors rebuild central authority. The army is reorganized. The imperial court becomes more elaborate and distant. Taxation and administration harden. Cities adapt. Christianity continues to grow. By the early 4th century, Constantine will reshape the religious and political landscape in ways that would have astonished earlier Romans. The plague of Cyprian does not create this future by itself, but it belongs to the atmosphere in which older certainties weaken and new forms of meaning gain strength. That is why the epidemic's legacy is so unsettling. It shows disease not only as a destroyer of population, but as an accelerator of transformation. It can make old rituals seem insufficient. It can make minority communities more visible. It can expose the limits of imperial protection. It can turn charity into power, fear into accusation, mortality into doctrine, and private grief into public change. The empire catches fire, and plague is one of the flames that no army can defeat. By the time the 3rd century storm begins to pass, Rome is still alive, but it is less like the Rome of Augustus or Trajan, and more like a harder, more anxious, more militarized world. The old civic confidence has dimmed. The gods are still worshipped, but new faiths press forward. The frontiers still stand, but they feel less secure. The emperor still rules, but often from wherever the military emergency requires him to be. And beneath all of it lies the memory of a disease that moved through households faster than explanations could follow, leaving survivors to ask not only how to rebuild, but what kind of world they were rebuilding into. Justinian's fatal spring begins in a city that believes it stands at the center of the world. Constantinople is not merely a capital. It is a statement in stone, water, ritual, and imperial imagination. It rises where Europe and Asia nearly touch, where the Bosporus narrows and the sea roads of the Black Sea and Mediterranean can be watched, taxed, defended, and dreamed over. Its walls are among the most formidable ever built. Its palaces look toward harbours crowded with ships. Its churches glitter with mosaics and lamps. Its markets gather languages from every direction. Its granaries hold the harvest of distant lands. If any city seems designed to survive history, it is this one. Yet in the spring of 541 or 542, depending on how the chronology is followed, the plague arrives in the Eastern Roman world and reaches Constantinople with devastating force. Later tradition ties its path to Egypt. Grain roots, and the movement of goods through ports, though the exact sequence remains debated. What matters is that the disease enters a city dependent on imported food and constant circulation. The same system that feeds the imperial capital brings danger into its warehouses, docks, streets, and houses. Constantinople's strength is once again inseparable from its exposure. This pandemic is different from the earlier outbreaks in one crucial way. Modern science has identified its killer in multiple early medieval burial contexts. The disease associated with Justinian's reign was caused, at least in key documented cases, by Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind bubonic plague and its related forms. Ancient DNA recovered from human remains has given this catastrophe a biological clarity that Athens and the Antonine outbreak still lack. But even here, certainty has limits. Scholars still debate the total death toll, regional impact, routes of spread, and long-term consequences. The pathogen can be named more securely than the full shape of the disaster. The descriptions are horrifying. The historian Procopius, who lived through the reign of Justinian, gives the most famous account. He describes fever, swellings in the groin, armpit, or near the ears, delirium, coma, suffering, and death on an enormous scale. Some victims die quickly, others linger, some develop blackened skin or other terrifying signs. The city's normal systems collapse under the number of corpses. Burials cannot keep pace. Bodies are placed in towers, pits, and boats. The dead exceed the city's ability to honour them individually. Even if numbers in ancient accounts are exaggerated, the image remains clear. Constantinople experiences death at a scale that overwhelms ceremony, administration, and imagination. The timing could hardly be worse for Justinian. He has spent his reign pursuing one of the grandest ambitions of late antiquity, the restoration of Roman power in the West. His armies have reconquered North Africa from the Vandals and entered Italy in a long, brutal struggle against the Ostrogoths. His legal reforms seek to gather and clarify Roman law. His building projects, including the great church of Hagia Sophia, project imperial authority in sacred and architectural form. Justinian's world is not declining passively. It is trying to remake itself, to reclaim lost territories, to bind Christian empire and Roman law into a renewed order. Then plague begins removing the human substance from that dream. An empire can have laws, armies, generals, ships, and divine claims, but it still needs bodies. It needs farmers to grow grain, sailors to transport it, dock workers to unload it, soldiers to fight, taxpayers to pay, craftsmen to build, clerks to record, priests to pray, and gravediggers to bury. Plague cuts into all of these. It does not merely kill people in the capital, it ripples through the imperial system. Tax revenues may fall, military recruitment suffers, rural production is disrupted. Trade becomes uncertain, administrative routines strain. The evidence remains incomplete and regionally uneven, but the broad danger is obvious. Justinian is attempting expansion while plague is shrinking the living base on which expansion depends. One lesser-known detail is that plague may have affected not only the battlefield but the timing and endurance of campaigns. Wars in Italy dragged on for years, devastating the peninsula through siege, famine, movement of armies, and social breakdown. Disease added another layer to that suffering. The dream of restoring the Western Empire became more expensive in money, manpower, and time than its victories first suggested. No single explanation fully accounts for the limits of Justinian's reconquests, but plague likely reduced the empire's resilience at exactly the moment it needed sustained strength. The city itself becomes an image of imperial vulnerability. Constantinople's walls can stop armies, but not rats, fleas, breath, or contaminated movement. Its wealth can purchase grain, but grain ships may be part of the problem. Its churches can gather prayer, but gatherings can also gather exposure. Its bureaucracy can count, order, and command, but it cannot see the bacterium. Even the emperor reportedly falls ill and survives, a detail that gives the catastrophe symbolic force. The ruler of the Roman world can lie helpless under the same invisible assault as the poorest labourer near the harbour. The biology of bubonic plague gives the event a particular terror. In its classic form, Yersinia pestis circulates among rodents and their fleas. When infected rodent populations die, fleas may seek other hosts, including humans. The resulting buboes, those painful swellings in lymph nodes, become one of the disease's most recognizable signs. In some cases, infection can enter the bloodstream or lungs, becoming septicemic or pneumonic, with even deadlier possibilities. But ancient transmission was not uniform, and scholars still debate how different forms of plague interacted with climate, rodents, human ectoparasites, shipping, grain storage, and urban conditions. The simple story of rats and fleas is useful, but incomplete. Constantinople is almost perfectly placed for such complexity. It is a grain-fed capital with warehouses, ships, animals, dense housing, and constant traffic. Grain storage attracts rodents, ships provide transport, crowding provides hosts. Administrative necessity keeps supplies moving. The empire cannot simply stop feeding its capital, so the city remains connected while connection becomes dangerous. This is the ancient pattern in its most imperial form. Survival depends on the same networks that transmit catastrophe. The psychological shock must have been immense. For a Christian empire, plague demanded explanation within a world governed by providence. Was it punishment, trial, a sign of the end, a call to repentance, a mystery beyond human comprehension? Different voices offered different meanings. The plague did not weaken religion in any simple way. It often intensified it. Processions, prayers, charity, fear, and theological interpretation all deepened. But belief did not erase horror. A city can be devout and still be overwhelmed by corpses. As the pandemic spreads beyond Constantinople, its reach becomes difficult to measure. It appears across parts of the Mediterranean and Near East, recurring in waves for generations. Some regions suffer severely, others may be less affected. The evidence is patchy. Written sources cluster around literate centres. Archaeological and genetic evidence is growing but still incomplete. Older histories sometimes portrayed the Justinianic plague as a decisive cause of the end of antiquity, a demographic collapse that shattered the ancient world. More recent scholarship is more cautious, emphasizing regional variation and warning against making the plague explain everything. Yet caution should not flatten the catastrophe. Even if it did not single-handedly end civilization, it struck a world at a pivotal moment and changed what was possible. Justinian's empire survives the first wave. That fact matters. The state continues to legislate, fight, build, tax, and govern. But survival comes at a cost. The restored territories in the west remain fragile. Italy is exhausted. The Balkans face pressure. The eastern frontier remains contested. After Justinian, the empire will confront new wars with Persia and, in the 7th century, the explosive expansion of Arab Muslim armies. The plague is not the only force behind these transformations. but it belongs to the weakening of the old Mediterranean order. It removes people, drains resources, and adds uncertainty to a world already stretched by ambition and war. What makes Justinian's plague feel like a near ending is the scale of the contrast. On one side stands imperial grandeur, Hagia Sophia newly built, Roman law codified, armies marching west, coins bearing the image of authority, a capital shimmering between continents. On the other side are bodies stacked because burial space has run out, houses emptied, officials overwhelmed, and a bacterium moving through the foundations of empire. It is not the fall of civilization in one dramatic instant. It is more disturbing than that. It is civilization continuing while death moves through every system that keeps it alive. When the first great wave passes, Constantinople remains. Its walls still face the land, its domes still catch the light, its harbour still receives ships. The emperor's city has not vanished, but the dream of effortless restoration has been darkened. The ancient Roman world, already transformed by centuries of crisis, war, religion, and migration, has met a plague that can now be traced not only in words but in bones and teeth. The invisible traveller has acquired a name, and that name will return again and again through human history, long after Justinian's ambitions have faded into ruins, mosaics, law books, and memory. Rats, fleas, grain, and ships form one of the most famous chains in plague history. But the chain is stranger and less tidy than the familiar image suggests. It is easy to picture the ancient pandemic as a simple invasion of black rats pouring from ships, carrying infected fleas into cities that have no defense. There is truth in that picture, enough truth for it to endure, but it is not the whole mechanism. The ancient world is not a laboratory with one clean pathway. It is a moving ecology of humans, animals, insects, food, climate, trade, and architecture. Plague travels through that ecology not like an army on a map, but like a spark finding dry places in a forest. The bacterium behind bubonic plague, Yersinia pestis, is a small organism with a devastating talent. In many plague systems, it circulates among rodents and the fleas that feed on them. Fleas bite infected animals, the bacterium multiplies, and under certain conditions the flea becomes an efficient transmitter. When the flea bites again, infection can pass into a new host. If rodent populations die in large numbers, their hungry fleas may seek other blood. Humans become accidental victims in a cycle that did not evolve for their convenience. In the human body, the infection may move to lymph nodes and produce the swollen, painful buboes that gave bubonic plague its name. If it spreads to the bloodstream or lungs, it can become even more lethal. But ancient plague is not solved by naming the bacterium. The deeper mystery is how a disease rooted in particular animal ecologies becomes a pandemic across continents. For that, the grain ship matters. Grain is life for ancient cities. It is also bait. A ship's hold packed with sacks or loose cargo provides food and shelter for rodents. Ports provide warehouses, docks, ropes, baskets, spilled kernels, refuse, and endless hiding places. A single harbour can become a meeting ground for rats from different vessels and neighbourhoods. If infected fleas or rodents are present, the port is not merely receiving cargo, it is receiving an ecosystem. The black rat, Rattus rattus, is especially important in many discussions of ancient plague because it thrives around human settlement, climbs well, nests in buildings and ships, and feeds on stored food. Yet scholars still debate exactly how dominant black rats were in every region and period, how their populations shifted and how consistently they carried plague across long distances, the evidence remains incomplete. Rat bones are small and not always preserved or identified. Ancient DNA from pathogens is rare compared with the scale of the historical events. Climate, local architecture, storage practices, and competing rodent species all matter. The rat is a major suspect, but not a complete explanation by itself. Fleas are even harder to reconstruct. Their bodies rarely survive in ways that satisfy historians. The most famous vector, the oriental rat flea, is highly efficient under certain conditions, but it is not the only possible carrier discussed by researchers. Human fleas and body lice have been considered as possible contributors in some plague transmission scenarios, especially where human-to-human spread appears too rapid for a simple rat flea model. This remains debated. No single explanation fully accounts for all historical patterns. What is clear is that ancient people lived in close contact with parasites. Clothing was worn repeatedly, bedding could be shared, crowded houses offered warmth and hosts, bathing existed, sometimes elaborately, but not evenly enough to create modern hygiene. The human body itself could become part of the transport system. Ships turn local danger into maritime danger. A port outbreak does not need to infect an entire city before it moves onward. It only needs one vessel to depart with infected rodents, fleas, people, or cargo. Ancient sailing is seasonal, shaped by winds, storms, currents, and political control. But when sea routes are active, they can move disease faster than overland travel. Grain fleets are especially significant because they connect food-producing regions to hungry capitals. Egypt's grain, for instance, is not merely a commodity, it is a strategic lifeline. To feed Constantinople or Rome, ships must move, even when movement carries risk. Civilization keeps opening the door because the alternative is hunger. This is why plague so often reveals the hidden dependence of great cities. A capital may present itself as self-sufficient in power, law, and glory, but its stomach lies elsewhere. Its bread grows beyond the horizon. Its survival depends on farmers it never sees, sailors it barely honors, dock workers it may ignore, and warehouses where rodents conduct their own quiet business beneath the floorboards. The emperor may command the empire, but the flea does not recognize command. The official may count grain, but he does not count the bites that happen in the dark. One lesser-known detail is that grain storage itself can shape disease ecology across time. A bad harvest reduces food for humans, but stored grain can sustain rodent populations near settlements. Conversely, climate conditions that increase rodent numbers in one region can create a larger reservoir for infection before humans notice anything is wrong. When those rodent populations crash, fleas may disperse. The relationship between food, rodents, climate, and plague is therefore unstable. Plenty can create risk. Scarcity can create risk. The pattern depends on timing, species, season, and contact. This is why ancient observers, lacking the invisible framework, often saw only divine anger or corrupted air, where modern science sees a chain of ecological opportunities. The miasma theory, the belief that disease could arise from bad air, decay, or environmental corruption, was not absurd from an observational standpoint. Rotting bodies, stagnant water, marshes, waste, and foul smells often did accompany sickness. People noticed that unhealthy places smelled bad. They associated corruption of air with corruption of bodies. They were wrong about microbes in the modern sense, but not foolish about environment, bad sanitation, crowding. And decay really do accompany many diseases. The tragedy is that a theory can point towards some useful behaviours, such as cleaning or avoiding foul places, while missing the precise mechanism needed to stop transmission. In the case of bubonic plague, a city might clean streets and still fail if infected fleas remain in rodent nests. People might avoid the visibly sick but continue handling infested bedding, grain sacks, or clothing. They might flee a house after several deaths, carrying parasites with them. They might burn incense in a room where rats are dying behind the wall. Their actions are not random. They are rational within their worldview. But plague exploits the gap between visible cause and actual cause. Pneumonic plague adds another terrifying possibility. When Yersinia pestis infects the lungs, it can spread through respiratory droplets from person to person, producing a faster and often deadlier form of transmission. Ancient sources do not always allow us to distinguish bubonic from pneumonic forms, and scholars still debate how much pneumonic spread contributed to various outbreaks. But even the possibility changes the picture. A disease that begins in rodent flea cycles can, in some circumstances, enter a human-to-human route. The invisible traveller can change vehicles mid-journey. The ancient port is therefore not only a place on a map, it is a biological machine with many moving parts. There are warehouses stacked with grain, animals nosing through refuse, sailors sleeping in close quarters, merchants arriving from distant coasts, labourers carrying loads against their bodies, officials moving from ship to ship, water sources shared by strangers, and shrines where people pray for safe passage. A plague bacterium does not need to master all of this. It only needs enough successful transfers to keep moving. And movement does not stop at the harbour. Grain goes inland, sailors visit taverns, porters return home, rats spread through buildings, fleas bite new hosts, merchants take roads onward, officials carry documents and exposure. Families gather around the first sick person without knowing whether care is safe. The port becomes a seedbed, and the city becomes soil. Some seeds fail, some root. This complexity is why plague history remains debated even when the pathogen is known. Ancient DNA can prove that Yersinia pestis was present in a person, but it cannot always reconstruct the route by which that person was infected. Written sources can describe swollen glands, but they cannot identify the flea. Archaeology can find mass graves, but not every bite. Climate records can show stress, but not the exact moment when rodent populations shifted. Each type of evidence catches one angle of a moving event. The full mechanism must be inferred, carefully, and always with humility. Still, the outline is clear enough to be unsettling. Ancient civilization had built a vast system for keeping people alive by moving food, goods, labour, and information. Plague entered that system at its most practical points: the granary, the ship, the warehouse, the road, the crowded house. It did not need to overthrow civilization from outside. It nested in the infrastructure of survival. The bread that fed the city could arrive with the conditions for fever. The ship that prevented famine could carry fleas in its seams. The warehouse that stored abundance could shelter rats beneath abundance. This does not mean ancient people were doomed by ignorance alone. Even modern societies, as with microscopes and antibiotics, have learned that connected systems can transmit shocks quickly. The ancient world simply faced the problem without the instruments to see it clearly. Its people could observe death following ships, illness clustering in neighbourhoods, fear spreading through markets, and corpses overwhelming burial places. What they could not see was the tiny exchange between flea and blood, rodent and cargo, lung and breath. They lived inside the evidence but outside the explanation. So the story of rats, fleas, grain, and ships is not a footnote to plague. It is the hidden engine beneath imperial catastrophe. It explains why the greatest cities were not merely victims by chance, but targets by design of their own success. To become a capital was to become dependent. To become dependent was to become connected. To become connected was to open pathways through which life and death could arrive together, packed in the same hold, unloaded at the same dock, carried through the same gate, and brought home before anyone knew the voyage had truly begun. Climate turns against humanity slowly at first, then all at once. A season is too dry, a flood arrives too late, a winter lingers, a summer feels pale. Grain heads form poorly in the fields, vines suffer, pastures thin, animals weaken. Prices rise in markets before most people understand why. Then hunger begins moving through society with the same quiet intelligence as disease, finding the poor first, the displaced next, the overtaxed, the crowded. The people whose reserves were never more than a few bad weeks deep. Plague is terrible on its own, but plague in a hungry world becomes something darker, because the body facing infection is already negotiating with exhaustion. Ancient people are highly attentive to weather. Farmers, sailors, soldiers, priests, and officials all depend on it. They watch winds, floods, frost, drought, storms, and strange skies with the seriousness of people whose lives are tied to the season's behavior. What they lack is the global picture. They cannot know that a volcanic eruption far away may send particles into the upper atmosphere, dimming sunlight and cooling regions across continents. They cannot measure ocean patterns or reconstruct shifts in rainfall over decades. They experience climate as local fate, a failed harvest, a bitter spring, a river that does not rise properly, a sky that seems wrong. Modern evidence has widened that view. Tree rings, ice cores, lake sediments, pollen records, and other environmental archives show that ancient societies sometimes faced abrupt climatic shocks. One of the most important episodes comes in the 6th century, around the time of Justinian. In the years 536 and after, parts of the world experienced severe atmospheric disturbance, likely linked to major volcanic eruptions. Contemporary writers describe dim sunlight and strange conditions, while scientific records point toward cooling and disruption. Scholars still debate the exact sequence, regional severity, and relationship between climate and plague, but the coincidence is haunting. Just before the Justinianic pandemic, the world appears to have entered a period of environmental stress. This does not mean a volcano caused the plague in a simple line of doom. History almost never works so cleanly. Yersinia pestis requires reservoirs, vectors, hosts, and pathways of movement, but climate can alter every one of those conditions. It can affect rodent populations by changing food availability. It can push animals toward human settlements. It can weaken harvests and increase grain storage pressures. It can move people through famine, migration, trade disruption, and military instability. It can reduce human resistance by worsening nutrition. No single explanation fully accounts for pandemic disaster, but climate stress can prepare the body and the landscape for disease. A hungry person is not merely a person with an empty stomach. Hunger changes immunity, strength, behavior, and choices. Families sell tools, animals, land, or future labor. Children become more vulnerable. People crowd into towns seeking relief. Armies requisition food more harshly. Banditry and unrest may rise. The boundary between survival and desperation narrows. In such conditions, an epidemic does not strike a stable population. It strikes a population already forced into movement and compromise. The plague then appears not as a separate catastrophe, but as the second blow in a sequence. The ancient state is also vulnerable to climate. Governments depend on predictable extraction. Tax systems assume that harvest will produce enough surplus to feed households and satisfy officials. Armies assume supply. Cities assume grain. Religious calendars assume seasonal return. When climate interrupts agriculture, the state must choose between reducing demands, enforcing them harder, importing food, releasing stores, or watching legitimacy erode. None of these choices is easy. A ruler who fails to feed a capital risks riot and rebellion. A ruler who strips provinces to feed the capital may create misery elsewhere. Plague entering this situation does not need to destroy institutions outright. It can make every decision worse. One lesser-known detail is that disease and climate may interact through landscapes people barely notice in ordinary times: wetlands, field margins, abandoned farms, granaries, and rodent habitats. If warfare or mortality reduces cultivation, fields can revert to scrub or grass, changing animal communities. If cooling shortens growing seasons, food scarcity may shift storage patterns. If heavy rains follow droughts, rodent populations may boom, then crash. The evidence remains incomplete for many ancient regions, but the principle is clear. Epidemics emerge from ecosystems, not from empty space. Human history and natural history are entangled at the level of seed, burrow, bite, and breath. The Nile offers another example of dependence. Egypt's agricultural rhythm shaped the food security of empires. When the Nile flood was good, fields flourished and grain moved outward. When it failed, hunger spread through a system built around expectation. A capital like Constantinople could seem far removed from the mud and water levels of Egyptian fields, yet its bread depended on them. The same riverine system that made abundance possible also tied distant populations to environmental variability. If disease moved along grain routes, then climate and plague met not abstractly, but in the hold of a ship. In earlier centuries too, climate and disease likely overlapped in ways difficult to reconstruct. The plague of Athens struck during war and crowding, but wartime displacement itself changes environmental exposure and food access. The Antonine Plague followed military campaigns across regions with different disease ecologies. The plague of Cyprian unfolded during a century of political and economic instability, in which local harvest failures would have carried amplified consequences. We should be careful not to force every epidemic into a climate explanation. Scholars still debate many connections, but it is equally mistaken to imagine disease moving through a neutral world. Weather, food, animals, and human movement shape the paths of infection. Ancient observers often interpreted climate anomalies morally or cosmically. A dim sun, a failed harvest, an earthquake, a comet, a flood, and a plague could be folded into one language of disorder. To modern ears this may sound superstitious, but there is a deep intuition beneath it. The world is connected. They were wrong about many mechanisms, yet right that human life depends on balances beyond human command. The sky, the field, the river, the rat, the flea, the ship, and the body all belong to the same story. When climate turns hostile, civilization's margins narrow. A wealthy city may draw food from farther away, but that increases dependence on transport. A state may move grain by force, but that creates resentment. A family may survive one bad harvest, but not 3. A village may recover from fever if the fields are strong, but not if the seed grain has already been eaten. Resilience is not an idea. It is stored food, healthy bodies, trusted institutions, available labor, and time. Plague consumes all of these. This is why the ancient plague that nearly ended civilization cannot be understood as only a medical event. It belongs to a larger pattern of stress. Disease is the blade, but climate may be the hand that weakens the shield. War may crowd the victims. Trade may carry the pathogen. Hunger may open the body. Fear may break trust. Together, these forces can make a civilization feel as if every layer of protection has failed at once. And when the weather improves, the damage does not simply vanish. Children who die are not replaced by sunshine. Lost skills do not return with the next harvest. Abandoned fields require labor to reclaim. Tax arrears, debts, orphaned households, and weakened armies remain. The memory of failed seasons lingers in prayer, policy, migration, and burial. A society that survives climate and plague may emerge altered, more cautious, more coercive, more religious, more fragmented, or simply poorer in people. The sky above ancient catastrophe is therefore not background scenery. It is part of the machinery of history. A pale sun over Constantinople, a failed flood in Egypt, a drought-scarred field in North Africa, a cold spring along a frontier, a wet season that swells rodent numbers somewhere beyond imperial attention, all may contribute to the conditions in which disease becomes more than disease. The plague moves through bodies, but the disaster moves through the whole world those bodies depend on. The villages that went quiet are harder to see than the cities. A capital leaves walls, columns, laws, coins, chronicles, churches, baths, and ruins large enough to make later ages stop and stare. A village leaves thinner traces, a scatter of pottery, a line of post holes, a collapsed roof tile, a field boundary grown faint beneath later soil, a cemetery at the edge of a settlement, a well-filled inn, a hearth gone cold. Yet most people in the ancient world do not live in marble capitals. They live in smaller places where the catastrophe of plague is less likely to be written down, but no less real. When disease passes through such a settlement, there may be no historian nearby to describe it. No one records the first fever, the second household, the moment when the strongest man in the village cannot rise, the day the last healthy adult stops tending the animals, or the week when burial becomes a task beyond the strength of the living. The evidence remains incomplete because rural grief rarely becomes literature. Still, archaeology sometimes catches the afterimage. A farmstead is abandoned, a cemetery expands suddenly, a storage pit remains unused, a house is not rebuilt after burning. Fields once cultivated begin returning to scrub. What survives in the record suggests that plague did not only shake imperial capitals, it also hollowed out the ordinary landscapes that fed them. A village is vulnerable in a different way from a city. It is less crowded, which can slow some diseases, but it has fewer reserves. There may be fewer healers, fewer labourers to replace the sick, fewer stored supplies, fewer carts, fewer officials, fewer alternative households to absorb orphans. If the harvest must be brought in and half the community is ill, the grain may fail even if the field itself is healthy. If oxen are neglected, ploughing suffers. If seed grain is eaten during a crisis, next year's hunger begins before next year arrives. A village can survive many things through cooperation, but plague attacks cooperation by attacking the people who perform it. The rural world is also not isolated. This is a common misconception. Ancient villages are tied to markets, landlords, tax collectors, temples, military recruitment, seasonal labour, roads, and kinship networks. People travel to sell produce, attend festivals, pay obligations, seek justice, marry, serve in armies, flee raids, or find work. Merchants and officials pass through. Soldiers requisition supplies. Pilgrims stop for water. Disease can arrive by any of these routes. A village may seem distant from the harbour where the plague first entered, but distance is not safety when grain, taxes, animals, and people keep moving. One lesser-known detail is that rural abandonment after epidemic does not always look like sudden ruin. Sometimes it looks like simplification. Fine pottery becomes rarer, imported goods disappear, buildings are repaired more crudely, diet changes, coin use declines, cemeteries continue, but with fewer markers. This can mean poverty, insecurity, shifting trade, political change, or plague mortality. Often it means several at once. No single explanation fully accounts for these patterns in every region, but they remind us that collapse is not always a dramatic emptying. Sometimes it is a narrowing of life. In the countryside, plague and taxation can become entangled. Ancient states often demand taxes in money, goods, or labour, regardless of whether a household has lost members. If officials are rigid, survivors may be crushed by obligations calculated for a population that no longer exists. If the state relaxes demands, its own revenues fall, weakening armies, cities, and administration. Either path creates strain. Landlords may try to hold tenants, tenants may flee. Abandoned land may be reassigned. Enslaved people may be moved to replace lost labour. The death of villages becomes a legal and economic problem as well as a human one. There is also the matter of memory. In a small community, every death is personal. The loss of one elder may mean the loss of stories, boundaries, songs, rituals, planting knowledge, healing practices, and remembered agreements. The loss of several adults can distort an entire generation. Children grow up with missing parents, missing neighbours, missing teachers. Marriages shift because there are fewer partners. Inheritance becomes tangled. Some houses gain land because other lines vanish. Others disappear entirely. Epidemic rearranges the future through absence. The archaeological silence of villages can be misleading because survival often leaves less dramatic evidence than destruction. If a village endures, people clean, reuse, rebuild, and disturb earlier traces. If it dies completely, later farmers may plough it flat. In wet climates, organic materials vanish. In dry places, remains may survive but remain unexcavated. Scholars still debate how far particular rural contractions were caused by disease rather than war, climate, economic restructuring, or migration. Responsible interpretation requires caution. Yet the cumulative picture is clear. Pandemics must have reached far beyond the cities whose writers preserve the horror. The countryside also reveals how plague changes landscapes. Fewer people can mean fewer cultivated fields. Terraces collapse without maintenance. Irrigation channels silt up. Orchards go untended. Pasture patterns shift. Woodland returns in some places. Wildlife moves into spaces once controlled by human labour. To later eyes, this can look peaceful, even beautiful green growth over abandoned land. But that quiet may be the botanical form of disaster. The landscape heals in one sense while remembering human loss in another. In some regions, burial grounds show the pressure of sudden death. Multiple bodies may be placed together. Graves may be shallower or less carefully prepared. Normal distinctions of age, status, or ritual may blur. But rural people often try to maintain dignity, even under strain. Hurried burial is not necessarily a careless one. A simple grave may still represent love under impossible conditions. The absence of rich objects may reflect poverty, fear, religious change, or the fact that survivors needed every usable thing. The dead are evidence, but they are also people, and the record must be read without turning emergency into spectacle. As epidemics recur, villages may become part of a larger rhythm of repopulation and loss. Survivors from one settlement move into another. Land is consolidated. Marginal farms are abandoned first. Better land continues. Some villages shrink but persist. Others vanish from the map, their names surviving only in documents or not at all. A road may still pass nearby, but fewer carts use it. A church, shrine, or temple may remain after the houses around it thin out. The sacred place outlives the daily community, standing as a marker of where life once gathered more densely. This rural perspective changes the meaning of the phrase nearly ended civilization. Civilization is not only emperors, philosophers, laws, and monuments. It is the repeated work of ordinary people producing food, raising children, repairing tools, maintaining paths, tending animals, remembering boundaries, and showing up for one another. When plague empties villages, it attacks the foundation beneath the visible world. A city can survive for a while on stored grain, tribute, or imported food. But if enough countryside falters, the city's grandeur becomes a shell. And yet, the villages also show resilience. People return to fields. New families take over old houses. Children are born into places where the dead are still near. Farming resumes because hunger allows no permanent mourning. The countryside is stubborn. It absorbs catastrophe in ways that can make suffering hard to detect later. A settlement may shrink, adapt, and continue under another name, another landlord, another faith, another empire. The quiet after plague is not always the silence of extinction. Sometimes it's the silence of exhausted survival. The ancient record favours the roar of capitals, but the real measure of plague lies partly in these quieter places, in the village where no inscription records the dead, in the field that goes unploughed for one season, then two, in the family line that ends without a monument, in the cemetery where graves crowd together for a few terrible months, in the path slowly covered by grass because fewer feet pass that way. The plague that shakes empires does so by entering households one at a time, and many of those households stand far from palaces. So after the fever leaves the capital, after the chronicler finishes his account, after the emperor issues new orders, the countryside continues to bear the slower wound. It is there that labour must be rebuilt, land reclaimed, children raised, and memory carried without books. The villages that went quiet remind us that civilization nearly ends not only when a throne falls, but when enough small fires go out across the dark. Faith after the pestilence does not remain untouched, because plague enters the most sacred rooms of human life. It stands beside the bed where prayers are whispered. It waits at the threshold of temples, churches, shrines, synagogues, sanctuaries, and household altars. It interrupts funerals, stains festivals with fear, and forces people to ask why the world has become so violently uncertain. Ancient religion is not a private corner of existence. It is woven into law, weather, fertility, victory, childbirth, harvest, healing, and death. When plague arrives, it does not merely kill believers. It challenges the systems by which communities explain why anything happens at all. In many ancient societies, epidemic disease could be understood as a sign of divine anger. ritual pollution, broken vows, neglected gods, cosmic imbalance, or moral disorder. This was not irrational within the worldview of the time. If the health of the community depended on right relationship with divine powers, then mass death suggested that something had gone terribly wrong in that relationship. People responded with sacrifice, procession, purification, fasting, prayer, offerings, vows, and renewed attention to healing deities. The evidence remains incomplete for many local reactions, but what survives in the record suggests a repeated human pattern. When ordinary knowledge fails, ritual becomes urgent. Yet plague also makes ritual difficult. The sick may be too numerous to visit. The dead may be too numerous to bury properly. Priests and attendants may die. Sacred spaces may become crowded with desperate bodies. The very act of gathering for protection can increase danger. This is one of the bitter contradictions of epidemic religion. People turn toward one another and toward the sacred because fear demands meaning, but proximity may feed the disease. A procession meant to save a city can become, in biological terms, another path of exposure. Ancient people could not fully know this, but they could feel the terrible confusion when piety did not guarantee safety. Plague also reshapes ideas of moral duty. In ordinary times, caring for kin, honouring the dead, and performing rites are expected obligations. During epidemic, those obligations become dangerous. To wash a body, nurse a fever, carry food to the sick, or prepare burial may require courage. Some people flee, some stay. Some abandon strangers but care for family. Some care for strangers because their faith, philosophy, or honour demands it. No single behaviour defines ancient humanity in crisis. Fear and compassion exist side by side, often inside the same person. Christian communities gave this problem a distinctive answer. By the 3rd century, writers such as Cyprian framed care during plague as a test of faith and charity. Later Christian memory often emphasized believers nursing the sick and burying the dead when others retreated. This should not be exaggerated into a simple story in which one group alone was compassionate and everyone else was cruel. Ancient pagan, Jewish, and other communities also possessed traditions of care, duty, and mercy. But Christianity placed unusual emphasis on service to the suffering as a mark of spiritual identity, and epidemics gave that identity public force. In a world of fear, organized compassion could become persuasive. One lesser-known detail is that burial itself became a form of religious witness. To bury the abandoned dead was not only sanitary or emotional, it was sacred labor. In many traditions, an unburied body represented disorder, shame, danger, or spiritual incompletion. During plague, when corpses outnumbered available hands, those who continued burial work took on a role both practical and symbolic. They defended the dignity of the dead when the machinery of society failed. What survives in the record suggests that such acts mattered deeply to how communities remembered themselves afterward. But faith after pestilence could also darken. Fear seeks patterns, and patterns become accusations. Foreigners, religious minorities, travellers, the poor, the visibly ill, and those who resisted dominant rituals could be blamed for divine anger or contamination. In the Roman world, Christians were sometimes accused of endangering the community by refusing sacrifice to traditional gods. In other times and places, different minorities would become targets. The mechanism is tragically familiar. An invisible threat creates demand for a visible enemy. Scholars still debate the details of many local persecutions and accusations, but the broader human impulse is clear enough. Plague changes theology by making death unavoidable. It presses thinkers to explain suffering that does not respect virtue, rank, age, or prayer. Why does a child die while a cruel man survives? Why does the healer fall before the patient? Why do the devout and impious share the same grave pit? Some traditions answer with judgment, some with trial, some with fate, some with mystery, some with calls to repentance, and some with acceptance of impermanence. None can remove the bodies, but explanations shape behavior. They decide whether people flee, serve, blame, repent, celebrate, despair, or rebuild. In the Byzantine world, plague deepened the relationship between imperial power and divine interpretation. An emperor's duty was not only administrative but sacred. If the empire suffered, people might look toward sin, heresy, neglected piety, or providential testing. Churches became places of appeal and memory. Saints associated with healing gained importance. Relics, icons, and holy figures could become focal points of hope. This did not mean everyone agreed on meaning. The evidence remains incomplete, and reactions varied by class, region, and moment. But plague made the invisible moral order feel intensely present, even when the biological cause remained unseen. At the same time, repeated epidemics could produce spiritual exhaustion. If each outbreak was explained as punishment, then people had to live with the fear that catastrophe might return whenever the divine-human relationship failed again. If plague was a test, the test seemed endless. If it was mystery, the mystery was cruel. Ritual helps people endure, but repetition can strain belief. Some become more devout, some become fatalistic, some become skeptical of promises that sound too easy. Ancient sources often preserve the confident voices of religious leaders, but beneath them must have been countless quieter struggles, grief that did not fit doctrine, anger that could not be spoken, and faith rebuilt in fragments. Plague also altered social authority. Those who could organize care, burial, food distribution, prayer, or explanation gained influence. Bishops in late antiquity increasingly became civic figures, partly because cities needed leaders who could act when traditional structures weakened. Temples, churches, and charitable networks could provide continuity where state mechanisms faltered. This did not happen overnight, and plague was not the only cause. But epidemic crisis exposed the value of institutions that could mobilize people around duty and meaning, not merely command. The rituals of memory mattered after the bodies were gone. Communities needed to remember without being destroyed by remembering. Anniversaries, prayers for the dead, stories of martyr-like caregivers, warnings about divine judgment, and moral lessons all helped shape plague into narrative. This is how disaster becomes legacy. The raw event is unbearable. The story makes it survivable. But stories also simplify. They turn complex suffering into examples. Heroes, sinners, punishments, miracles, or signs. The historian must listen to those stories while also noticing what they leave out. What plague reveals most starkly is that civilization depends on shared meanings as much as shared infrastructure. Roads, granaries, laws, and walls matter, but so do burial customs, trust, compassion, and explanations of suffering. When too many people die too quickly, society must decide whether the sick are still owed care, whether the dead are still owed dignity, whether strangers are threats or neighbours, whether gods are angry or silent, and whether life after disaster has any moral shape. These are not secondary questions. They are part of survival. Faith after pestilence is therefore neither simple comfort nor simple superstition. It is an arena of crisis. It can produce courage, charity, endurance, scapegoating, persecution, reform, humility, and fear. It can preserve the dead in memory or turn them into warnings. It can help rebuild trust or harden boundaries, like the roads and ships that carried disease. Religion is a human network, and plague moves through it by changing what people believe they owe one another. After the fever fades, the sacred landscape remains altered. A shrine gains new offerings. A church remembers those who served. A community avoids a place associated with death. A family keeps a burial custom more carefully than before. A preacher turns catastrophe into lesson. A survivor prays differently, with less certainty perhaps, but more urgency. The plague has passed through bodies, but it has also passed through meaning, leaving behind a world where death feels closer, duty heavier, and the line between fear and faith more fragile than it once seemed. Collapse or transformation is the question that haunts every plague story. It is tempting to imagine civilization as a great building, struck by disease until the pillars crack and the roof falls in. The image is dramatic, and sometimes it feels close to the truth. Athens behind its walls, Rome receiving sick soldiers from the east, Constantinople filling burial pits during Justinian's fatal spring. Each seems, for a moment, like a world approaching its end. Yet history is rarely so clean. Civilizations do not always collapse like towers. Often they bend, shrink, harden, scatter, and become something else while still insisting they are continuous with what came before. Plague makes this difficult to measure because it destroys both people and evidence. A city that loses thousands may still mint coins. An empire that suffers demographic shock may still issue laws. A village that shrinks may remain occupied by a few families whose pottery looks much like before. Continuity can hide catastrophe. At the same time, catastrophe can be exaggerated by writers who experience their own moment as the end of everything. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how deeply each ancient epidemic changed the societies it struck. The safest answer is also the most interesting: plague rarely acts alone, but it can accelerate every other pressure already present. In Athens, plague does not single-handedly defeat the city. Sparta does not win because a pathogen writes the strategy. The war continues for decades after the first outbreak. Athens makes choices, some brilliant, some disastrous. Allies revolt, fleets sail, generals rise and fall. Sicily becomes a catastrophe for reasons larger than disease. Yet the plague changes the early war profoundly. It kills Pericles, drains manpower, damages morale, disrupts burial customs, and corrodes confidence in law and piety. Athens survives, but the Athens that survives is not simply the Athens that entered the war. Disease does not end the civilization of the polis, but it helps darken its most famous crisis. In Rome, the pattern is broader and slower. The Antonine Plague strikes an empire still capable of enormous action. It does not bring immediate political collapse, but it likely reduces population, weakens armies, strains local economies, and adds pressure to frontiers at a moment when imperial expansion has already reached its limits. Then, in the 3rd century, another great epidemic unfolds amid political breakdown, currency trouble, invasion, civil war, and religious change. Again, plague is not the only cause, but to remove it from the story would make the empire seem more resilient than it was. Epidemic death lowers the margin for error. Rome's later transformations emerge from a crowded field of causes, and disease is one of the most merciless among them. With Justinian, the question becomes even sharper. Did the plague end antiquity? Some older interpretations placed enormous weight on the pandemic, imagining it as a demographic hammer blow that shattered the ancient Mediterranean economy and doomed Justinian's reconquests. More recent scholarship often urges caution. Some regions show continuity. Some evidence for massive population collapse is uneven. The empire continued after the first wave and remained a major power for generations. Yet caution should not become denial. A pandemic caused by Yersinia pestis, recurring over generations, striking cities, armies, and countryside, must have mattered. No single explanation fully accounts for the end of the old Mediterranean order, but plague helped reduce the range of futures available. This idea of reduced futures may be the best way to understand epidemic history. Plague does not always decide what happens, it narrows what can happen. A ruler has fewer soldiers, a city has fewer workers, a family has fewer adults, a farm has fewer hands, a tax system has fewer payers, a religious community has more grief to explain, a frontier has less flexibility. When another shock comes a war, drought, invasion, succession crisis. Famine, the society has less stored strength with which to answer. Collapse is not one blow. It is the failure to recover before the next blow lands. One lesser known but crucial point is that plague can create winners as well as losers, though the word feels almost indecent beside mass death. Survivors may inherit land, tools, houses, positions, or opportunities. Labour scarcity can raise the bargaining power of some workers in certain contexts, though states and elites often respond by tightening control. Religious groups that organise care may gain moral authority. Political leaders who manage relief effectively may strengthen legitimacy. Merchants who survive disrupted networks may profit from scarcity. Epidemic transforms society unevenly. It ruins many, empowers some, and leaves others suspended between loss and opportunity. This unevenness is why the word collapse can mislead. A civilization is not a single organism with one pulse. It is a landscape of classes, regions, institutions, and memories. One city declines while another grows. One trade route fades while another opens. One language loses prestige while another spreads. One religion falls back while another advances. A rural district empties, but a fortified town nearby becomes more important. A centralized empire weakens, while local powers gain autonomy. To someone at the imperial court, this may feel like decline. To someone rising within a new religious or regional order, it may feel like transformation. Yet transformation should not be made too gentle. It is easy, from a distance, to admire adaptation and forget the cost. A shrinking city is not merely an urban form adjusting to new conditions. It is households gone, workshops silent, schools diminished, monuments unrepaired because the living have more urgent needs. A changing labour system may reflect opportunity for some, but also coercion for others. A religious revival may bring charity, but also scapegoating and fear. A new political order may be more sustainable, but it is built over graves. Transformation is what survivors call the world after collapse has selected its victims. Plague also changes time. Before epidemic, people plan with a certain expectation that tomorrow resembles today. They plant trees whose fruit will come later. They train apprentices. They arrange marriages. They build houses, repair irrigation channels, copy manuscripts, invest in trade, and enter public life. During plague, the future contracts. Immediate survival overwhelms long projects. After plague, the future returns, but altered. People may rebuild, but they remember that continuity can break. That memory can make societies more religious, more cautious, more authoritarian, more charitable, more suspicious, or more resigned. The psychological aftermath is part of the historical aftermath. In the ancient world, where written records often speak for elites, it is difficult to trace this inner shift directly, but it appears in laws, sermons, burial changes, settlement patterns, military reforms, and moral writings. It appears in the way disasters are folded into stories of divine judgment, imperial weakness, civic decay, or miraculous survival. It appears when rulers respond to labor shortage with compulsion, when bishops become civic leaders, when cities fortify, when rural estates reorganize, when trade contracts, when local identities matter more because distant authority feels less reliable. Plague does not invent these changes, but it presses them forward. So did ancient plague nearly end civilization? In one sense, no. Humanity continues. Cities survive. Empires endure longer than catastrophe seems to allow. Knowledge is damaged but not erased. Fields are replanted. Children are born. Ships sail again. The ancient world does not fall into permanent silence after any one epidemic. But in another sense, yes, plague repeatedly brings civilizations close to thresholds beyond which they cannot return unchanged. It nearly ends particular worlds. Periclean Athens, the confident high Roman Empire, Justinian's dream of restored Mediterranean unity, countless villages whose names are lost. Civilization survives by ceasing to be exactly what it was. The distinction matters. If we search only for total endings, we miss the deeper power of disease. Plague's greatest historical role may not be annihilation, but forced metamorphosis. It turns strength into vulnerability, exposes dependence, kills memory keepers, breaks routines, and leaves survivors to rebuild with fewer people and altered beliefs. It does not always knock down the monument. Sometimes it removes the society that knew how to maintain it. After the great epidemics, the stones remain, the walls of Constantinople still stand, Roman roads still cross landscapes, Athenian texts still survive, laws, prayers, coins, ruins, and stories continue. But the living world around them has shifted. The question is not whether civilization ends in a single night of fever. The question is how many times it can be remade by death and still recognize itself in the ruins it inherits. The pathogen's long shadow stretches far beyond the ancient world that first carried it through grain ships, barracks, ports, and crowded streets. Long after Justinian is dead, long after his reconquered territories fracture, long after the old Roman Mediterranean becomes a different political landscape, plague remains somewhere in the deeper ecology of the world. It does not need human memory to survive. It waits in animal reservoirs. In landscapes where rodents and fleas maintain cycles beyond the notice of kings, human beings remember in chronicles, prayers, ruins, and inherited fear. The bacterium remembers nothing. It simply persists. This is one of the most unsettling truths revealed by modern science. Plague is not only a historical event, it is an ecological possibility. Yersinia pestis can retreat from human catastrophe into animal populations, where it may circulate quietly until conditions allow it to spill back into human communities. That means the end of one pandemic wave is not necessarily the defeat of the organism. It is only the end of a particular encounter between pathogen, environment, and society. Ancient people could see the disappearance of symptoms and think the danger had passed. In one sense, it had. In another, it had merely gone elsewhere. The Justinianic plague appears to have recurred in waves for generations after the first catastrophic outbreak. The timing, intensity, and geography of these recurrences remain debated, and the evidence remains incomplete. Some sources describe repeated returns of pestilence across the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Some regions seem to suffer deeply, others are harder to assess. Ancient DNA has confirmed Yersinia pestis in several early medieval contexts, but it cannot yet map every route, every reservoir or every flare. Still, the pattern is clear enough. The first wave is not the whole story. Plague becomes a recurring presence, a shadow crossing generations. Then, centuries later, the same broad enemy returns in another devastating form, the medieval Black Death of the 14th century. That later pandemic belongs to a different world, with different trade systems, climates, cities, and political conditions. But its biological connection to Yersinia pestis links it to the ancient story. The Black Death kills on a scale that reshapes Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia, leaving behind mass graves, labour upheaval, religious crisis, persecution, art, literature, and demographic transformation. It is not simply a repetition of Justinian's plague, but it proves that the ancient catastrophe was not an isolated nightmare. It was part of a longer relationship between human civilization and a pathogen capable of returning when networks, hosts, and conditions aligned. One lesser-known detail is that the history of plague is now partly written in genomes. By sequencing ancient bacterial DNA, researchers can compare strains across time and place, reconstructing evolutionary relationships among plague lineages. This has shown that Yersinia pestis has a deeper history than medieval chronicles once suggested, with ancient forms appearing thousands of years ago. Some prehistoric strains may have lacked genetic features associated with efficient flea transmission, which raises fascinating questions about how plague evolved and how its modes of spread changed over time. Scholars still debate the implications, but the discovery pushes plague out of the narrow frame of famous pandemics and into deep human history. This genetic evidence does not make the story simpler, it makes it richer and stranger. If plague-related bacteria existed in prehistoric populations, then ancient human mobility, pastoralism, trade, and settlement may have interacted with disease long before the great literate empires described their epidemics. The pathogen's long shadow may pass not only through Rome and Byzantium, but through Bronze Age migrations, steppe routes, early farming worlds, and communities that left no written word. The evidence is still developing, and no single explanation fully accounts for how these early strains affected societies. But the possibility changes the scale of the mystery. Plague is not merely a late antique disaster. It may be one of the hidden biological pressures accompanying human expansion for millennia. Ancient DNA also changes how historians handle old arguments. For generations, scholars debated whether the Justinianic pandemic was truly bubonic plague. Some doubted the identification because written symptoms can be ambiguous and mortality estimates uncertain. Genetic evidence did not answer every question, but it settled an important part of the debate. Yersinia pestis was present. The same method may eventually clarify other outbreaks, though many will remain elusive. The plague of Athens may never yield a definitive pathogen. The Antonine plague may remain probable rather than certain. The plague of Cyprian may keep its biological mask. Science can recover astonishing things, but the past still keeps some doors closed. The long shadow is not only biological, it is cultural. Plague teaches civilizations to imagine sudden reversal. It enters religious language, political warning, medical theory, and collective memory. It becomes a symbol of divine anger, corrupted air, social disorder, foreign danger, moral testing, and the fragility of wealth. Later societies inherit not only the disease but the stories around disease. They remember that cities can fill with corpses. They remember that burial can fail. They remember that rulers can be powerless. Such memories shape responses to later epidemics, sometimes wisely, sometimes disastrously. In the centuries after antiquity, methods of controlling epidemic disease develop unevenly. Isolation, movement restrictions, inspection of ships, pest houses, and eventually formal quarantine emerge more clearly in medieval and early modern contexts, especially as port cities confront repeated plague threats. These measures are born from observation more than full biological understanding. People still lack germ theory, but they learn that time, distance, and controlled contact can matter. The ancient world glimpsed contagion in behavior and fear. Later societies begin turning that fear into institutions. Even then, success is partial. Trade resists interruption, hunger pressures policy, fear produces evasion. The old conflict remains. Civilization depends on movement, while disease exploits movement. The shadow also lies in human bodies. Some researchers have explored whether repeated epidemic disease shape genetic patterns related to immunity in affected populations. These questions are complex and still debated. Natural selection can operate during severe disease events, but linking specific historical outbreaks to specific genetic changes is difficult. Populations move, intermarry, shrink, expand, and experience many diseases at once. Still, the idea is powerful. Plague may leave traces not only in graves and texts, but in the biology of descendants. The dead do not simply vanish from history. Their survival or death can influence the genetic future. Yet there is danger in seeing plague as destiny. Pathogens are powerful, but they do not act in isolation from human choices. Trade policies, war, urban planning, poverty, burial customs, care networks, food systems, and political trust all shape outcomes. The same bacterium can produce different histories in different societies. Some communities suffer catastrophic mortality. Others are spared or recover faster. Some respond with compassion. Others respond with violence. Biology opens the crisis, but culture determines much of its path through human life. That is why the ancient story remains relevant without needing to be forced into easy lessons. It shows the recurring pattern humans build networks to overcome distance, scarcity, and danger. Those networks create new vulnerabilities. Disease enters through the practical systems of survival. Societies interpret the shock through their beliefs. The aftermath changes institutions and memory. This pattern appears in Athens, Rome, Constantinople, medieval ports, and later worlds. The names of diseases change. The structure of vulnerability remains. The pathogen's long shadow also humbles the idea of historical control. Empires imagine permanence. They carve laws into stone, stamp coins, build walls, and name cities after rulers. A bacterium has no monument and no ideology, yet it can alter the fate of those who do. It can interrupt campaigns, thin populations, shift labor systems, and darken the meaning of an age. It does not write history, but it changes who is alive to write it. And still, humans keep returning. After each plague wave, people rebuild houses, reopen markets, reinterpret faith, resume trade, and try to make the world predictable again. This persistence is not triumph in a simple sense. It is more fragile and more impressive. Civilization survives not because it defeats nature once and for all, but because it repeatedly rebuilds inside nature's uncertainty. The plague remains in memory as a warning that the foundations are never as separate from the living earth as stone walls make them seem. By following the pathogen's shadow across centuries, the ancient outbreaks become more than isolated disasters. They become early chapters in a continuing story of humans, microbes, animals, climate, and connection. The same forces that made old cities splendid made them exposed. The same hunger for exchange that spread ideas, religions, technologies, and wealth also carried fever. The shadow stretches because civilization keeps moving, and wherever civilization moves, the invisible world moves with it. What civilization survived is not the same civilization that fell ill. This is the quiet truth beneath all the larger arguments about plague and collapse. Athens survives its fever, but the bright confidence of its early war years is wounded. Rome survives the Antonine disaster and the 3rd century pestilence, but its empire grows harsher, more militarized, more anxious, more dependent on coercion and sacred authority. Constantinople survives Justinian's plague, but the old dream of restoring a seamless Roman Mediterranean fades into a world of exhausted provinces, altered frontiers, and future shocks already gathering beyond sight. The ancient world does not simply end under the plague, it passes through the plague and comes out changed. Survival can look deceptively ordinary. A market reopens, a field is planted, a tax is collected, a ship leaves harbour, a child is named after a dead relative, a wall is repaired with stones taken from an older building, a priest, bishop, healer, or village elder resumes duties that never truly stopped. These acts are small compared with imperial campaigns and mass graves, yet they are the true machinery of continuity. Civilization survives because someone bakes bread after the funerals. Someone copies a text. Someone teaches a child where the boundary stones stand. Someone remembers the road to the next town. But every act of rebuilding carries absence inside it. The baker may be using the oven of a brother who died. The field may belong to a household reduced by half. The tax register may have fewer names. The ship may sail with a smaller crew. The child may grow up in a family shaped by missing voices. Plague leaves behind not only ruins but rearrangements. It changes who inherits, who marries, who works, who rules, who prays, and who remembers. What survives in the record suggests that ancient societies often endured catastrophe not by returning to normal, but by redefining normal around loss. This is why the idea of civilization nearly ending must be handled carefully. If civilization means the complete disappearance of cities, writing, agriculture, religion, trade, and political order, then plague did not end it. Human beings continued. Institutions adapted, empires endured, divided, transformed, or were replaced. But if civilization means a particular arrangement of confidence, population, power, memory, and possibility, then plague ended many civilizations many times. It ended the Athens that might have fought its war under Pericles longer. It ended countless family lines that left no inscription. It ended villages whose names are gone. It helped end the old Roman assumption that scale itself was security. One lesser-known trace of survival is the way old infrastructures continue to guide life after the society that built them has weakened. Roman roads keep shaping movement even when Roman power changes. Aqueducts may be repaired, neglected, reused, or mined for stone. City walls built for one military world defend people in another. Churches rise inside old civic spaces. Markets gather where markets have long gathered because geography remembers usefulness. Plague kills people. But it does not erase every pattern they made. Survivors inherit not a blank world, but a wounded framework. The same is true of knowledge. Some knowledge disappears with specialists. Crafts decline where workshops vanish. Administrative habits weaken where literate officials are fewer. Medical explanations remain limited, yet other knowledge persists through copying, teaching, ritual, and habit. Ancient texts survive because generations decide they're worth preserving. Often in monasteries, schools, courts, and private collections far removed from the original world of their creation. The fact that we can still read accounts of plague is itself evidence of survival through fragile chains of care. Every manuscript that outlives an epidemic is a small defiance of disappearance. The survivors also inherit questions. Why did the plague come? Why were some spared? What should be done differently? How much movement is safe? Whom can be trusted? What is owed to the sick? What does power mean if it cannot prevent invisible death? Scholars still debate the answers ancient people gave, and those answers varied widely. Some turned to stricter piety, some to charity, some to blame, some to fatalism, some to administrative reform. No single explanation fully accounts for the range of responses, because plague does not strike one kind of human being. It strikes the fearful, the brave, the selfish, the generous, the powerful, the forgotten, and the confused all at once. And there is another survival. Quieter still, the survival of the pathogen's lesson in human memory. Ancient plague taught that the world is more connected than it appears. A sickness in a port can become a crisis in a capital. A harvest failure can weaken an army. A flea can matter to an emperor. A burial custom can reveal the strength or failure of a community. A road is never only a road, and a ship is never only a ship. Civilization is not separate from the bodies that sustain it, or from the animals, climates, waters, insects, and fields surrounding those bodies. The ancient plague that nearly ended civilization therefore leaves no single final scene. It leaves many. Athens still arguing after the fever, Rome still minting coins after soldiers die, Carthage still praying and burying, Constantinople still standing above the Bosporus after the corpse pits are closed, villages shrinking, shifting, returning, or vanishing beneath grass, graves holding teeth in which modern science will one day find the trace of a killer no ancient eye could see. The story does not end with one empire falling. It ends with humanity learning, again and again, that survival is not the opposite of catastrophe. Sometimes survival is what catastrophe leaves behind.